Good morning. I sound loud from up here. Sound loud all the time. It's okay. I'm getting a few thumbs up. Good morning. Welcome to Silver Spring, and welcome to the first inaugural implantable brain-computer interface collaborative community. To all of you. So congratulations to all of you for being here. It's great to see so many friends, old and new, as we really kick off for the first time as our first public meeting, this incredibly important venture to help to create, as we'll describe many times over the course of the morning, and make available in an equitable and wide way these incredibly powerful technologies of implantable brain-computer interfaces. So the first order of business, of course, is to thank all of you for being here. This is a group of people, both online and in the room, who are incredibly busy, incredibly dedicated across any number of ways to this field and to science and medicine, to helping people with paralysis or limb loss. So thanks for not only your being here today, but for all the work that you've collectively done, either over the past 6 months, and we'll talk about the history in a little while, or over the past year and a half to really get this started. I'd like to thank our colleagues from FDA and CDRH. You'll see some of them around. They are focused, but not entirely, at one table at the moment for being here. And that includes some folks who early on helped, Drs. Michelle Tarver and Brittany Caldwell, who are so important in this broader collaborative community program in educating us about what a collaborative community is and what it could be. And of course, to our friends, colleagues at the FDA, who are looking at what many of the people in this room send them and are keeping their eye and really helping both to innovate and to ensure the safety and efficacy of the devices that are all going to be created over the next few years and are already, in some cases, in pilot clinical trials. I'd like to thank our 17 charter signatories. Won't read their names. They are up there. They were the Coalition of the Willing that over a series of several months back a year ago reviewed documents over and over and over again that got us closer to a charter, which we'll show you a little later. Would like to thank Bailey McGuire, who may be online from Mass General Brigham. They are our back office. Having a group like this, we need a back office. We need somebody who can truly take administrative responsibility for everything that needs to happen to remain compliant as a collaborative community, and really grateful for Bailey and the team at MGB-AI for doing so. And in bold at the bottom, for those who haven't met her, a big round of applause and thanks to Jessica Kellerman, who really made all of this happen today. So Jessica is, as you've all seen through emails and other ways, our iBCI-CC program manager, and is responsible for everything that's going to happen today and everything that's going to happen in the future. So it's all her. Just a few logistical notes for those who are here. Coffee is over there. There are 2 exits in the back. There's another exit to my right and most of your lefts. Over there. Restrooms, if you head out the door and take a right, restrooms are on your right. There are microphones that will largely be used later. There's one in the center of the room. When we get to Q&A, Jake Guzman, who may be outside or maybe here. Jake, are you visible? Jake's around somewhere. All right, he will be also handing mics out for the Q&A in a little while. For those who are online, and for those who are in the room for that matter, we're going to have a series of presentations to start the morning. Please think about your questions, note your questions, keep them in your head, and then we'll start a Q&A session at 10:15. Those who are on Zoom, I believe chat likely does not exist. Q&A does exist. Still recommend that you keep those questions until 10:15, at which point they'll be acknowledged and they'll be read aloud. This is our first public meeting of the iBCI-CC. We really want your feedback. This is new to me. This is new to us. It is the first collaborative community in the clinical neurosciences. So we are all learning together, and we want your feedback. We want to know how to make this ever better and how to make it the most impactful consortium that we possibly can to move forward these incredibly important devices. You should have in front of you a booklet that includes our agenda. Won't go through the agenda. This is the public meeting part of the agenda, which will get us through just before lunch. Zoom is live. Cameras are live. Reminder to those of you in the room who are amongst friends, microphones are live. So what you're whispering to your colleague might just be captured, so whisper really quietly if that's your intent. But otherwise, this is a recorded and public meeting that will be posted on the iBCI-CC website afterwards. I'm just going to, having said that out loud, I'm going to look over at Enrique and our friends at ETS, making sure from a Zoom perspective, everything's going well. Got a thumbs up. That's great. Thank you. And then after lunch, we will reconvene and with instructions from Jessica to engage in our work groups. We'll now move on to a word from one of our organizers. We had to think about this date really carefully. Jen French has been unbelievably important and continues to be incredibly important in putting together this collaborative community and leading this collaborative community. She, together with Joe and myself, helped organize this collaborative community, and we know that she couldn't make it on this day, but she's about to tell us why. So a word from Jen. And I'm going to press click. We'll see if this starts. There we go.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for gathering today and taking the time out of your schedules. Whether you are here online or in person, you are a key component of the collaborative community. By the time you see this video, I will be right here in Tanzania. And although I would love to be with you all today, involved in the lively discussions with the characters that we have gathered here, instead I will be in the Serengeti looking for characters like lions, giraffes, and zebras. And please reassure that none of you should be acting like any of these characters. But as many of you know, traveling as a wheelchair user takes a lot of planning, and this trip to Africa was a long time in the making. So please accept my heartfelt apologies for not being with you today. But before we dig into the agenda, I just want to mark the significance of this moment. It wasn't very long ago that the iBCI-CC was only an idea, a vision. And today it's a reality. Look around the room. We have gathered a great group of people, but this is not the end point. This is only the beginning. Those of us here today and involved in the implantable brain-computer interface collaborative community have the opportunity, the skill, and the will to change the landscape as we go forward. You know, we are living in really exciting times. We have a technology that can change the way that we treat and the way that people live with neurological conditions. You know, it's no surprise to this audience when I say that 1 in 3 people worldwide are afflicted with a neurological condition. It's also probably no surprise to you that neurological conditions are the leading cause of illness and disability globally. And you know what? The numbers can be appalling and even striking. But I don't want you to focus on the numbers today. I want you to think instead about the people. I want you to think about the adolescent with cerebral palsy who is struggling in school, not because of cognitive ability, but because of impaired speech. I want you to think about the people who are emerging from war zones, who are and will be struggling with post-traumatic stress. I want you to think about the people living with ALS who are yearning for an in-depth conversation with their loved ones. And I want you to think about the person who has just experienced traumatic paralysis and is in need to interact with the world. We have the opportunity to make change with the technology that we have today and the technology that's being developed in the near future. But we have challenges ahead of us. The Valley of Death is rife with novel technologies, and it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what that causes of those failures. And implantable BCIs are facing these same obstacles that could lead to a burial in the Valley of Death. But we don't want that. No, believe me, we don't want that. But we do have a lot of unanswered questions before us. What are the clinical endpoints? Who's going to prescribe it? How will it be maintained? Who's going to pay for it? And how much will they pay? What are ethical ways that we can handle neural data? And geez, how is the public going to perceive this technology as we move forward. And believe me, we have many more unanswered questions. But these questions cannot and should not be solved alone. If we work together, they can be addressed. So I want you to look around the room, whether you're in person or virtually. This room is filled with diversity, and diversity can bring disagreement and opposing perspectives, and that's okay. In fact, it's by design. So while you engage today and you begin to interact with each other, I ask that you approach your interactions not with the well-known behaviors of a hyena, which are that they can be aggressive and excitable, but instead, I'd like you to approach today and your interactions today with the not so well-known behaviors of a hyena, which is that they're collaborative, they're sociable, and they're curious. So be respectful in your interactions and seek common ground. The iBCI-CC is not a product of the organizers. It's a platform for the community. And communities only thrive when people are engaged and involved. And that's what we're asking you to do today. And I know that we are all stretched in a million different directions and we are all stretched on time. But small contributions can yield big results in a collaborative community. We together are the product of change, and we need to do so in a collaborative and thoughtful manner. So please enjoy today, have some wonderful interactions with your colleagues, and I can't wait to see and hear the results from what we have today. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to Lee and Jessica.
Thank you, Jan. She mentioned that she would have no Wi-Fi access where she was, which just reinforced that as much as she wanted to be here, she couldn't be here today, but what a great introduction. So as she just mentioned, this is a group with diverse viewpoints. Though some of that diversity is reflected between Jan and I and how we think of all of you. She apparently thinks that we're all a bunch of hyenas. I think we're a lot closer, at least, to being like my family's new puppy. Also curious, friendly, learning boundaries, has sharp teeth, but at the end of the day is really learning every day, much like our own collaborative community. And this was just a chance for me to show off the new puppy. With that in mind, there we go. So really glad to see everybody today. I believe next, making sure that we're on schedule, it's really a pleasure for me to introduce three of our colleagues who are going to come up in just a moment and introduce themselves. But this collaborative community has an official letter of liaison and participation from the FDA. It is, from my perspective, from all of our perspectives, an unbelievably wonderful opportunity to engage in informal discussion with the folks who are truly thinking about the future of this field every day. Together with FDA and folks from other federal agencies who are here, in addition to the companies, the scientists, the ethicists, the physicians, the clinicians, and people, most importantly, with lived experience of paralysis who are here in the room. I think together we're really going to be able to have an incredible collaborative community and one that really makes progress for this field. So there'll be a quiz later. You'll be required to know exactly where in the FDA kind of tree the incredible acute injury devices team and the OHT5 team sits in the environment that they work in. And I know you're going to hear a little bit more about that in just a moment. And with that, I believe David is up first. Is that true? Happy to introduce David McMullen, Director of OHT5. It's good time. Heather and Julia.
We travel in numbers for protection, like in the Serengeti. So I really want to thank Jen for kicking this off. I mean, I don't need to even speak to the motivation You heard it directly from her. But I do want to start off and thank everyone for coming, for traveling to DC, to Silver Spring in person, for joining online, because you are all truly what makes up this collaborative community. We have a great team internally at FDA. Many of you interact with us, but we can talk to each other every day. But getting all of your perspectives is really what's key and important here. And especially before we start off, I think I missed a few names on the slide that Lee showed, but I do want to thank Lee, Jen, and Joe for helping kick off this collaborative community. This is a lot of work. All those individuals have many things on their plates, and they could have said, we have more than enough, but they really stepped up and helped put this together so that this can be the rising tide that lifts all BCI ships. So with that in mind, for those attending our workshop tomorrow, you'll see that Lee is kicking us off. I don't know if we got asked before or after we asked Lee to kick us off to help kick off today, but there's a pretty ambitious title in your agenda books, but I want to break that down a little bit. So first we'll talk about who we as FDA are, FDA's prior involvement in BCI, how we really got here, what a collaborative community is. It's not something any of us learned in school. And then what is FDA's particular involvement in this implantable BCI collaborative community? So Lee gave you the text form of our org chart. I like to say here at FDA, we're an open book test, so I'll give you a little bit more beautified org charts as well. So at FDA, there's a variety of centers, I believe 9, three of these are medical related. So you've probably heard of CDER. That's where drugs are regulated, or CBER, where vaccines or biologics, gene therapy might be regulated. We're within the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health. So if you think devices, think CDRH. And if you don't think about devices, next time you go to the doctor's office or if your loved one's in the hospital, look around that room and you will see hundreds of devices. So this is really important work that one might not think about initially when they think about medical interventions. Within CDRH, here's another org chart. We're within OPEC, just so you've heard it once. We're in the Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices. As you'll see on this figure, this is almost like a medical review of systems. So if you're looking at your eyes, your heart, your lungs, you'll go to different offices depending on the technology and the indications, what sort of patient population you might be treating. We're the office that is mostly relevant to the brain, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, and OHT5. As Lee mentioned, I'm the director for our Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices, and just wanted to throw up our divisions, our teams, because you may interact with any of these, and it really spans quite an awesome amount of medical areas, from neurosurgery, neurology, psychiatry, physical medicine, and rehabilitation. As Lee mentioned, our acute injury team, led by our esteemed Dr. Heather Dean, is primarily where brain-computer interfaces and especially implantable brain-computer interfaces reside. But I did just want to highlight these other teams because depending on the specific indication, what patient population you're looking at, there might be teams across this. And to confuse things just a little bit, as I pointed out, these other offices, depending on what you're looking to do, visual restoration might be in our OHT1. There are other offices. But again, the vast majority of these implanted brain-computer interfaces will be within OHT5, the acute injury devices team. So what have FDA's efforts been to address BCI challenges to date? I'll get into these in a little bit, but FDA doesn't have too much money. There is some funding, surprisingly, but our involvement is usually with our resources, our limited bandwidth that we have in the office. And so we've had workshops in the past, put out guidance, have some small amount of funding, done a lot of outreach as well with various groups, and we've had internal conversations with payers, patient groups, networks of experts, and that really motivates the value of a collaborative community so that everyone can be involved in these conversations. And we also have some expedited interactions, such as our Breakthrough Devices program and our TAP program. So just to go through, I would say a limited history, let's call it the past decade. Many of you, you'll see a lot of names on this paper, and many more of you were in attendance at the FDA's brain-computer interface devices workshop meeting back in 2014. This meeting has a special place in my heart. I think I see Tracy Willer in the back. This is where I got my first non-medical job as I was leaving neurosurgery residency. And so these workshops are always a great place to meet folks as well. Fast forward to 2021, these things do take some time. FDA put out some guidance, which I hope has been invaluable to many of you as you think about implanted brain-computer interfaces for patients, and a lot of the non-clinical and clinical considerations that we're still building on. But this served as a foundational guidance so that FDA could communicate on this really important topic. We've also, as I said, been involved in conferences. Many of you were involved in the Brain-Computer Interface Export Controls Conference. So the FDA isn't the only government agency that's involved in these technologies. They're complex, they're exciting, they're cutting edge, and so sometimes other government agencies are interested in learning about them. So we help try to provide education across the government, but your all involvement is also critical there. And I mentioned that something I did not know, even though I came from a funding agency at NIH, I didn't know FDA had funding. I knew they had an intramural research lab, OSEL, Office of Science and Engineering labs, but I didn't know they can actually put out grants. But thankfully, under the Act for ALS, Accelerating Access for Critical Therapies for ALS, there were a few grants that we were able to put together and put out there, and one of which you'll hear some of the fruits of that work tomorrow at the FDA workshop. This is something else I wasn't fully aware, but FDA is the United States regulator, but we also exist in a international framework. And so CDRH International Affairs helps lead efforts, and part of those are government-to-government exchange. So we are able to and have had interactions with regulators on BCI across the world. And there's a lot of similarity in how we think about brain-computer interfaces and medical device regulation in general. But because there's a lot of unique aspects with these technologies, we view this as a helpful effort for us to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, it's almost a natural experiment. Every country might have its own unique approach. But on the big questions of safety and effectiveness, we want to make sure we're on the same page with international regulators to help encourage innovation, but ensure patient safety. I mentioned this before, but for those of you in town or even online, we are hosting a public workshop, a joint workshop with FDA and NIH tomorrow, focused on clinical outcome assessments, really to do the important work of demonstrating benefit. And so that will be Thursday and half a day Friday. So if you're in town, please come join us. We're at capacity, very nearly at capacity. If you didn't register, you still might be able to get in. But please reach out to us about that and watch online if not. Just briefly, for those who know, you are very well aware of these programs, but if you haven't heard of them, there's a few more interactive venues and almost accelerators within FDA. The first one is the Breakthrough Devices Program, and that's for devices that might provide more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases or conditions. Now, what this is not is a full FDA approval. It's not an FDA authorization. It's still a good sign for those of you in the NIH world. This is more like an R21. This is an early investment in high potential, not a full authorization, but still can lead to increased interactions with FDA staff that can help work on critical issues. And then I often like to say that our TAP program, our Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, so DARPA is not the only one that likes acronyms or acronyms within acronyms, our TPLC Advisory Program, or TAP, I often like to say it's breakthrough on steroids. So not only do you have even more interaction, access to FDA staff who you can work through critical issues with, but the goal is really to bring all stakeholders earlier in the process so that you don't view FDA in isolation. We understand we're an important gating mechanism in the device development ecosystem, but we surely are not the only ones. As Lee and Janet mentioned, and as you can tell from the different working groups, you have payers, you have patients, you have providers, professional societies. The goal of TAP is to bring all that in, utilize some of the extra resources and connections that folks might have on the FDA side, the government side, and folks we've hired from outside to bring that up earlier. And Katie Sales, representing ABC, is here, one of many groups that are involved in these efforts. So I do recommend thinking about that. You go from breakthrough to TAP if you have a new exciting technology. And if TAP is breakthrough on steroids, I would just say I think collaborative communities are the next level of that. You're all the rising tide that will lift all the ships in this area. So really do thank you for all your efforts. With that, I will introduce Dr. Heather Dean to talk about these collaborative communities.
Thank you, David. I'm Heather Dean. I am the Assistant Director in charge of the Acute Injury Devices team, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what FDA thinks of collaborative communities, including what a collaborative community is, what makes it unique, what they are not, a little bit about the current collaborative communities with whom FDA interacts, some example outcomes, and Julia Slocum from my team is going to talk about our specific need for and interaction with this collaborative community. So what is a collaborative community? And remember, this is CDRH's vision of this. So we provide materials, but it's the community that actually brings everyone together. These are an opportunity for you to come together where public and private sector members can work together to solve problems, really to achieve some common objectives and outcomes, tackle those tricky issues such as who is going to reimburse for these devices, what does that clinical care team look like, what is the public thinking about these devices. It's also a chance to build up an environment of trust, respect, empathy, and openness. As Jen French talked about, bring out the good aspects of hyenas and work together in a very collaborative way. So what makes these unique? So they are established not by FDA, but by you, by the community. And you have invited us to participate, and we're very glad to be here. These collaborative communities tend to be focused on broader outcomes and impacts than many of the groups with which FDA works with, such as panels or task forces. And you might have several work streams. As you know, you have many working groups, and there may be multiple deliverables for each. These are also indefinite. So as long as there is a need for the community to come together to answer these questions, collaborative community can go on. There's no set endpoint. And the members include many, many, many stakeholders. It brings everyone together with an equal voice in decisions. So just to reiterate, these are not led by, convened by, or intended to advise the FDA. We're not directing the membership or governance, and this is not a task force, working group, or commission for the FDA. So this is one of 17 collaborative communities with which CDRH is interacting right now. As you can see, there are a number of different areas that these collaborative communities exist in, and it's been very exciting to see what these groups are producing. Some examples are tools. We have a chance to develop tools that can help the entire community move forward. There may be peer-reviewed publications, research agendas, white papers. There are discussions on healthcare coverage and reimbursement decisions. You might develop best practices for the field. Templates or frameworks that might be useful for multiple stakeholders. And it has that opportunity to bring everyone together for improved relationships. And with that, I will turn it over to Julia to talk about this particular collaborative community.
Hi, I'm Julia. So one of the unique aspects of working at FDA is that we get to engage with diverse stakeholders across the spectrum of these devices, but we often end up seeing indications or signs of developing issues that the field is going to have to face. But we are not able to solve those problems. That's not our role. However, this collaborative community, this could be within the scope of what you address. The iBCI-CC is poised to play a pivotal role in the future of this field. This is an opportunity for you to work together to establish consensus, to identify clinical endpoints and develop clinical practice guidelines and propose opportunities for how you might want reimbursement to work, all while maintaining a focus on ethics, patient preference, and user priorities. So the iBCI-CC working groups reflect the current priorities of the iBCI-CC and the collaborative community as a whole, and we acknowledge that these may evolve or grow as new priorities are identified, and we're excited to be a part of these working groups. As you can see, we've assigned 2 representatives from the FDA to each of the working groups, and we actually have a few people here. I'm gonna make you guys stand up from FDA who are representatives for these groups. We want you to be able to see us, know who we are, and come up and talk to us. We don't want to be a black box. So approach us. We are interested in talking to you. Oh, sorry. Well, as always, we want to mention that FDA wants to hear your perspectives, and we're interested in perspectives from industry and from academic stakeholders, but we're also interested to hear from patients, representatives, and healthcare providers. We hold regular patient listening sessions at the FDA so that we can gain feedback on your insights and preferences from the community. And we encourage patients to make their voices heard so that we can better serve your needs. And we've included our contact, well, maybe not, yeah. We've included our contact information here so that you can feel free to reach out to us. And thank you for your time and attention.
Well, as many of us in the room know, and as I think we now all recognize, we in this field couldn't be luckier to have such a smart, dedicated, collaborative, and hardworking team at FDA who is focused on this field, who is here presently in en masse, which is truly amazing, and as many people in the room have the opportunity to interact with this amazing team in any number of other venues, whether related to various investigational device exemptions or otherwise. We all know just how dedicated and how careful and how important your role is in allowing so many people to innovate, to do so safely, and to ultimately help us carve a path so that people with paralysis, people with limb loss, and people with other neurologic disease can have the very best neurologic devices as soon as possible. So thank you for all the work that you do. This is now when I get the opportunity to reintroduce the iBCI-CC. Part of this process, as we've all learned, is there's a small group who starts talking about an iBCI-CC. We have to name the iBCI-CC. We have to decide that it needs a hyphen. I'm happy to tell you why that is later. And you'll see a few slides now that are synergistic, only slightly overlapping with what you just saw, but that is at least some ways on purpose to share the perspective. So just to bring us all up to speed of what got us here today. So this will be far from a history of brain-computer interfaces, but we can easily go back to the late 50s, the early 60s to begin to see the beginnings of this field. Research funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Neural Prosthesis Program by the Department of Veterans Affairs and others, including ONR and DARPA. We skip ahead to the 90s, the 2000s, clinical research begins. The first of the investigational device exemptions in this field are issued, and that research begins in a couple of places. We'll now just take a 20-year block, a couple overlaps in a moment, all kinds of nice demonstrations, many of them repeated, of people who may have limited or no use of their hands, and in some cases unable or with limited speech, being able to control cursors, control robot arms, control their own limbs with an effector of functional electrical stimulation, some having some sensory feedback with intracortical microstimulation, being able to control tablets, being able to emulate handwriting, and sometimes to even recreate text-to-speech, either by thinking about the movement of their own hand or by thinking about speaking, that is, by intending to move or to speak. So there's where the field was scientifically, from an engineering standpoint, from an early clinical research standpoint, and overlapping with that, starting about a decade ago, were the creation of additional new companies that entered the space with public, federally funded and philanthropically funded research having sufficiently de-risked the field to allow industry to begin to pour their resources and to create these new companies with new devices and to begin to plan, in some cases, beginning to execute new trials. And around this time, there began to be some meetings across many of the people in this room and also online. That brings us to the 2019-2021 period, which we just saw, was on that basis, was this really great initially draft and then final guidance document from the FDA on implanted BCIs. If you haven't read this document, it is a great read. Please read this. It is incredibly informative, and it really just shows, even way back in 2019, just the depth to which our colleagues at FDA and those in this room are really thinking about this field and carving a path forward. But around that same time, even with the guidance document, even with the work that was being done, there were still some open questions. What are the clinical outcomes assessments? What are those measures for a pivotal iBCI trial that could lead to pre-market approval? Didn't know then, don't know now. What of these COAs could lead to public or private investment? We need to think about both of them. And how could we get a categorized, approved, reimbursed implantable BCI to get to the people who would benefit? And how do we continue to promote continued innovation? How do we get to generation 2, even if product 1, Gen 1, is approved? How can we ensure as a community that these devices, once approved and available, are available widely and equitably accessible? What are the guidelines for prescribing clinicians in this field? Today, there are none. Can potential users provide increased input into device design? Unbelievably important. We don't want, as a field, a very small group of engineers to develop something at a bench and release it to the world without the input of the people who could potentially benefit. I'm not saying that is what is happening at all, but we have the opportunity to ensure that there's more and more input as these devices are designed. How do we deal with the modularity of brain-computer interfaces? There are devices that record, there are devices and software that decodes, and there's the thing that happens after the recording and the decoding. Is that one system? Is it 3 systems? How does one get 1, 2, or 3 of these approved so they can become available to people who may benefit? What does the public understand about implanted BCIs? Clinical trial populations are typically a single disease or a single injury, purposefully narrowly constrained as inclusion criteria. Is that really the right approach for this field once we leave the pilot stage and get to pivotal? Unclear. And what are the ethics of this field? Neural recording, ownership of neural data. What do we think about privacy? What are the requirements for data security? How do we ensure the continuity of care if a device is placed and either ceases to function or the company that provided it has moved on and is no longer either around or able to support that device? Those were amongst the questions that were listed, and this is how we all felt. There are a lot of people doing a lot of work academically, scientifically in these companies to create devices, and these are still all largely unanswered questions. So it was on that background that early discussions began about forming a collaborative community for implantable brain-computer interfaces. a catalyzing moment, we saw this picture a little while ago, was back in February of 2023. There were early discussions about maybe we need some sort of collaborative community. And then the Department of Commerce wonderfully gathered a group of people for a public meeting on export controls. I heard a couple people kind of react there just for a moment. Just to be clear, are any of our friends from Commerce here? I know there was one, or maybe not yet. Yes, I see somebody who, yes, somebody I see. Oh, yes, hey, good to see you, everybody. So Commerce wonderfully gathered a group of people in this field to talk about maybe iBCIs are dual-use technologies. Maybe they could be technologies that would undoubtedly help people for medical reasons with paralysis. And maybe they might have some other use that required additional constraints on their development, on the people who could be engaged in developing these technologies in the US, and the ability to potentially sell or make available these same technologies or pieces of these same technologies to others around the world. Being very general on purpose, but given all the other questions that we had to answer in order to try to get technologies available to the people who would benefit, there was this moment in what is really a beautiful library, by the way, at the Department of Commerce, where we all looked at each other and said, there may well be competitors, unquote. There are multiple companies creating products that we hope all achieve their goals. But there was also a lot of common ground, and there were a lot of things that we needed to think about together, not just from a commerce and dual use perspective, but from all of these other questions that remained unanswered. So with that, and thank you again for having that meeting and the continued discussions. That led us to the last year or so. So with insights from FDA, from CDRH, and the history that you just heard of collaborative communities, and some great discussions with other collaborative community organizers. We'll talk about Joe in just a moment. We had experts who have led other collaborative communities. We called them, we spoke to them, we said, what are these collaborative communities achieving? Is this really worth the tremendous effort of the extraordinary people who are in this room today? And the answer over and over again from people who are very busy and very accomplished was yes, yes, yes. These can be of incredible help for the field, achieving goals for the field that can't be achieved any other way. You saw the list as a result of the many CDRH inspired but not convened and not led collaborative communities, of which we are, again, the first in the clinical neurosciences. So this is really an opportunity for all of us, neurology and neurosurgery and PM&R, in the neuropsychiatric community and elsewhere, to really be thinking about these types of devices. There was further discussion. The BCI Society had a meeting in Brussels back last summer, or I guess a summer ago, and where, again, there was more discussion about forming a collaborative community, and then a small coalition of the willing. We were instructed by these other collaborative communities to keep this small to start with, because there's only so many people that can work on a Zoom call, and so this coalition of the willing just laboriously went over a very legally precise charter that was formed, which I encourage you to all read at iBCI-CC.org/charter. It serves a very particular purpose. It is not a document rich in content, but it is a document that is very precise and very purposefully flexible for all of us in terms of its structure, allowing us to be here today, to have so many incredible people in the room, and to make all the progress that we're going to make. We signed the charter back on January 17th. Charter's there on the left, signatures are there on the right, and there's most of the people who were kind enough to think about creating that document and to signing it, representing the charter signatories. That's how we got to launch, but the work of all those folks was really to enable the work groups that would be coming up very soon. We then got our letter of liaison from the FDA, allowing the FDA's participation in the collaborative community. Just wonderful that it happened on Leap Day. So February 29th, so we'll celebrate, I guess, the anniversary of that letter in 2028, I guess is how that works. And then just a couple of weeks later, we were able to officially launch the iBCI-CC, and at a meeting of the American Society for Neurorehabilitation, which happened to be the following month, we began to gather to talk about some clinical issues related to brain-computer interfaces. So that's the kind of administrative history of how we got to where we are, and just as really a reminder of why we're here. So the vision for the iBCI-CC is one where we envision a future where implantable BCIs improve the lives of individuals, empowering each user of an iBCI-CC to lead a fuller and more independent life. That is why we're here. Our mission, I won't read it all in detail. It's there. It's also in your program books and on the website. We're set up to really use this concept of regulatory science that we'll hear more about in a while. I will very freely admit, the first time I heard the phrase regulatory science, I was quite sure that that wasn't actually a thing. I said, how could it possibly be a thing? And how could it be a thing that I would be even remotely interested in? But it turned out very quickly that I and many others became interested in just how this process of regulatory science can inform our field and can enable our field to do things that really couldn't be achieved otherwise. Really important that this is and continues to be an inclusive platform that convenes diverse stakeholders from around the field and the many vital inputs to creating devices and regulatory pathways and reimbursement mechanisms and ethics that supports this field the way that we all want it to be. Collective goal, foster collaboration among these diverse stakeholders, including researchers, clinicians, medical device manufacturers, patient advocacy groups, and people with lived experience to accelerate the development, safety, and efficacy evaluation and access to iBCI technologies. Important enough to read our collective goal out loud. And the way that we are getting there, to begin, is by creating 7 work groups. 7 work groups are listed there. Each of those 7 work groups has roughly 2, sometimes 1, sometimes 3, co-leads or interim co-leads who are just over the past 6 months have been helping to kick this off. The structure of this collaborative community, like others, is to, in addition to having work groups, each of those work groups can have 1 or more projects, and those projects will only be successful if those projects have at least 1 person who is truly leading them. So much of this activity, and we'll hear more from Jen in just a little while, has been happening through any number of Zoom meetings over the past 6 months. And of course, in the afternoon, we have a chance for those of us, both who are online and members of the iBCI-CC who are on Zoom or here, to continue the progress in these work groups. This doesn't mean we'll stay at 7, could become 6, could become 8. This is for us as a group to design. The outputs of these projects and of these work groups we'll hear more about from Joe in just a little while. Some of them are there on board, but it is the group that is here that will decide what is the right output for any particular project, where should it be reviewed, where should it be published, how does it become available, to inform some of the regulations and regulators, had to inform each other, to inform people with lived experience who are hoping that these devices will be created in the ways that we want, and most importantly, to get their education back to all of us. That is the crucial input of the people who will benefit from these devices. Last but not least, we had to create some boundaries, much like the puppy. Puppy needs boundaries. We needed boundaries too. We needed to define an implantable brain-computer interface in some way. We chose a way. It's not static, but we needed to find a way to start and then to grow from there. So devices that sense and interpret signals from the brain. The implantable, first word in the iBCI-CC, means that any device placed under the scalp or in the intracranial space, wherever that may be, will count as an implantable BCI. Could include intravascular, epicortical, and or intraparenchymal electrodes. And the goals of that device should be to facilitate restoration or rehabilitation of user function. For the moment, thinking now going back a year, we thought, and we still sort of think, that we weren't yet going to focus our energies on brain stimulation technologies, that is specifically on closed loop or adaptive deep brain stimulation. That seemed like more than we could chew. That was too big of a bite for us to start with. It's up there in yellow, not in red. We haven't completely excluded this. There's more discussions about that in the future. And it's quite clear that the afferent limb of any closed loop neuromodulation device is an implantable BCI. So we recognize the overlap, we recognize the modularity, we recognize the potential, but in all of our discussions, when we're thinking about the effectors, at least for today and for the near future at least, we're holding off on discussing closed-loop adaptive DBS and other technologies along those lines. We are not by any means excluding or meaning to exclude the components of intracortical microstimulation that may well inform the use of these implantable BCIs. But all of this is for us as a group to determine, not for anybody either up here or otherwise. So that is kind of a quick overview of how we got to this first public meeting today. And with that, I'm going to hand off to our iBCI-CC program manager, Jessica Kellerman, who will tell us more about what we've been doing.
All right, thank you. All right. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. We put a lot of work into organizing this, but it really wouldn't mean anything if you all didn't come. So you are really what is making this happen. So thank you. So I'd like to share some updates on what we've been up to since we've launched. And I'd like to start with our most important update, which is that we have a new logo. I didn't want to confuse you by putting up the old logo here, but I assure you it's new. It's around on the signs and the agenda, and we're very excited to have some representation and have an image to represent who we are, and it feels more real with the logo. All right, so what have we been up to these first few months? Well, we have been keeping very busy, starting with our launch on March 11th, and then we had our work group kickoff meeting on April 10th, followed by several months of lots of activity. We've had over 280 members join. We've had 20 work group meetings total across 7 different work groups, and we've had around 10 projects or so get started in the works across work groups. And of course, our most important milestone, which is our first annual meeting, which you're experiencing now. So just to kind of summarize what everyone's been up to in terms of the projects within the work groups. So a lot of work groups have been doing literature searches, kind of developing the basis of background knowledge that will help us set us up for success in developing our future projects. There have been developments of user journeys and patient journeys in order to map out important points of interest and what we should focus on going forward. And then, of course, we have been making lots of lists. There have been lists of standards, lists of outcomes, lists of priorities, lists of modular components. Everybody's making lists in order to identify what we know and what we need to know. And I also forgot to mention the bottom bullet point, which is the glossary project. Every work group has been working on this glossary project in effort to come up with one overall glossary that we'll be able to post on our website. So I'd like to speak a bit more about the glossary project. We'll talk more about some of the other projects if you will be coming to the breakout sessions later, but we won't be touching on the glossary project, so I'm going to focus on that a little bit. So for those of you that joined back when we assigned the glossary project, this may look familiar to you. We issued a set of purposefully open-ended instructions, and the reason why we left this pretty open-ended and vague is because we wanted to give the work groups an opportunity to develop their cadences and processes on their own, and that they did. And as a result, we have a wonderful set of glossaries in the making. As you can see, there have been some diverse approaches. Even if you can't really read the font on here, you can see even the formatting is a little bit different. We've had different approaches from across all the work groups. And so what are the next steps for this? We want to be able to merge these together. So the first next step is that work groups will come to a consensus on their glossaries by 9/27. So that will involve merging multiple versions that they have going, reconciling any discussions in the comments that they have, and delivering that to us organizers so that we can, as step 2, merge the glossaries together, reconcile competing definitions, help fill in missing components. Maybe there's some missing layperson definitions for some of the words. And then the next step is that we'll give that back to the work groups to review the merged draft. And then the fourth step is that the co-leads will finalize it, and then the organizers will publish it to the iBCI-CC website. And that will not necessarily be the final forever draft. So step 5 is that we will continue to update as needed. So we have taken more away from this glossary project than just a set of words. I think this was a really great learning opportunity to help us identify challenges and strengths in how we work together as work groups. So just some challenges. We noticed that some work groups do work at different tempos. This is not inherently an issue, but it is something to think about when we're working on collaborating together between work groups. There are also different approaches. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but understanding those different approaches does help us understand what works well and what doesn't. And there also has been a bit of scope creep in some of the discussions, and so we do want to make sure we remain focused. We experienced some document version control, multiple people working on different documents, and there has also been a concern for having overlapping efforts, both between the work groups. If we're working on the same project, there was concern that maybe we would end up doing the same words and we'd do duplicative efforts. And there was also concern that our efforts within the iBCI-CC might also duplicate what external groups are doing. There's an IEEE glossary that is being developed. And so there were a lot of concerns about how do we as the iBCI-CC make sure we're actually making a unique contribution and not just doing repetitive work. We also uncovered a lot of strengths in how we work together. The first is that people are really excited to contribute, which is awesome. We had a lot of people volunteering to help lead this project or jumping on and contributing in the documents. A lot of people put in a lot of work offline on this, which is awesome, and people enthusiastically discussed it during meetings. And I think that's a really good sign for the future projects and how we'll be able to work together on that going forward. We're also really good at yes and discussions. I noticed that there is a really positive culture here. If someone brings up an idea, everybody thoughtfully considers it and thinks about how to build upon that idea. And people have been avoiding the no buts, and we've just been building off of ideas, which has been great. And then, of course, everybody's been asking great questions of each other and of us as organizers, and really has us critically thinking about what we're doing. So what do we do with these going forward? We have a few takeaways on how we can change our approach in order to become more effective. The first is that we need to make sure we remain laser focused on our scope. That doesn't mean that ideas outside of the scope should be completely shut down. That those could be really great thoughts for later, or maybe really great thoughts for a different forum. But in order to make progress, we do want to make sure that we stay on task and within our predefined scope. We also noticed that projects tend to be a bit more successful if they have an identified project lead, as well as a team to help work on that project. I do think it was great in the situations where it worked that we just said, okay, everybody, whenever you have time, go in there and contribute. But it's very helpful to have someone that is in charge of driving that project forward, just to make sure things don't kind of fade off in terms of people putting an effort toward it. We also received feedback that the organizers should provide more structure, and I think that also may help with some of these other issues. So that's something we're working on doing, and please continue to give us feedback on how we can do that better. You'll notice for the breakout groups later this afternoon, we did attempt to provide a good amount of structure to the conversation. So please let us know how that goes. For making sure that we don't have any version control on documents, we do have an iBCI-CC Dropbox that we have created. And so let's try and use that to track which versions of documents are most up to date If you want to use Google Drive, I'm not going to prevent you from doing that, but let's at least have a source of truth where we document where we can find the most recent documents for things that we're collaborating on. We also want to have better channels for communication. That's something we're developing. We're looking into implementing Slack. And then we also want to have better forums for cross-group collaboration. So something that we're looking at doing is having regular meetings between co-leads of different work groups so that we can make sure we're collaborating on projects that require collaboration and we don't end up doing those duplicate efforts that everyone is worried about. All right, so taking a step back from the glossary and just thinking about all the projects as a whole, this is just a screenshot of our project management software showing that all the projects, all the work groups have been working on. We as organizers have been tracking it in the background and trying to do our best to find out how we can better facilitate how we're all collaborating together. And it's something we're all learning together on how to do. So please continue to give us feedback, and we're going to continue to iterate on this in order to become more effective. All right, so now I would like to introduce Joe Lenners, who is going to talk about regulatory science.
Thank you. I'm just going to say a couple words about Joe to pre-introduce Joe, I guess. First, thank you, Jessica. It's a tremendous amount of work that you've done to make this all possible. And just to kind of reiterate part of what Jessica was saying, we're all very capable of command control structures. We could, of course, provide incredible structure and precision from moment one. In terms of how this collaborative community could work, but we've really wanted to be sure that we're getting as much feedback as we can, both towards structure and function of this group. And I think so far it's working well. The initial controlled chaos was planned, and I think we're beginning to circle around the right approaches to doing this. And just as Jessica said, we really want your feedback at every step. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Lenners as well. Just a quick story about Joe. Just as we were talking about thinking that there could be an implantable BCI collaborative community, started to talk to a few people about what their collaborative communities were like, and Michael Mager, who's here somewhere, looking around, is here, maybe not raising his hand, no, I saw him earlier, is there, said, well, did you talk to Joe? And I said, who's Joe? And he said, Joe, the pathologist at your hospital. And I said, no, and I looked up Joe Lenners, and indeed, Joe Lenners was a pathologist at Mass General, where I spent some of my time. And it turns out that Joe, as he'll describe in a moment, is not only helped to form and lead the Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community, iBCI-CC, but this is a guy that loves regulatory science. It is a passion. If there was a clergy of regulatory scientists, Joe would be its high person. I'll try to remain completely non-denominational here. It's a collaborative community after all. Joe also has a tremendous passion for this field. He'll describe his background in a moment, and he's really led us in understanding how collaborative communities can form, how they can function at their very best. And as his now 750, how many are you now in iBCI-CC? 700. Close to 800 people strong, Pathology Innovation Collaborative Community. He's really given us great insights into what the iBCI-CC, what can we do, what can we achieve, and how can we do so most efficiently. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce the highest form of clergy of regulatory science to share his knowledge about regulatory science 101, Joe Lenners.
Thank you for this illustrious introduction. It's a little intimidating to be introduced like that in front of the FDA, so I don't know about that. So when I started hearing this, and you mentioned this earlier, I thought, how can there be science on something that is human-made? Because regulation is clearly human-made. And if you think about it, like, can there be science around legislation? which is also human-made, which is a bit weird, right? So I was very, very skeptical at first, and I thought that's all weird. So I share that sentiment. But as Lee just illustrated or mentioned, I have come full circle, and I'm a big fan now, and I think I've fully recognized the value, so I'm trying to bridge that gap. Maybe just why I'm so interested in this is because I think that technology really can change the world, not only for some people, but I think for many, many others. And my PhD is in neuroscience. I did some electrophysiology, single fiber recording. So there's some link to neuroscience that I abandoned when I went into molecular diagnostics. But that's a different topic for another day, maybe for a beer or so later on. So the first part is this Regulatory Science 101. 101 was ultimately, or initially, I think in the 20s or so, a course number that enabled people to switch from one college to another by having passed sort of an initial course. I don't know, I looked that up and I was just curious. So I'm trying to do the same here with like some level setting. And I know, as I just mentioned, there's some regulatory science experts from the various companies, but there might be some people here that have, just like I did in the beginning, no idea what this actually means. And I picked four rather simple things. Maybe they're not all resonating with everyone, but I hope one would be of help. This is sort of the outline of four simple points that I think should be at least known to everyone in the room as we discuss things later on. So you heard the FDA perspective on what collaborative communities are and what they're trying to accomplish. I think you mentioned that's the aim of what the FDA said sort of as the purpose of collaborative communities. What they actually realize practically might look a little bit different, and largely oversimplified, I think collaborative communities address exactly this interface between what regulations try to accomplish and then what scientists, technology, the industry, or patients want in a fashion when that is not immediately intuitive. It is very important that this is an activity in the pre-competitive space, so certain things are off topic, so there are guardrails around it. So it's not bridging every single thing. That's why there's only one puzzle piece there. At the same time, of course, these rules of engagement, those who read the charter and signed the code of conduct know what those are. But these rules and regulations around the collaborative community are really essential to make it work in a synergistic way. So to move a little bit away from this generic sort of like marketing style slide to a little bit more concrete elements here. So on the left, you see from recording to decoding and effecting the promise of the field. So there's a technology, a very innovative, or I should call it a series of devices, to use the regulatory appropriate term. And there's a chain, a signal chain, and that needs to be regulated, and there's a promise, and it's growing really rapidly. On the right, in a largely oversimplified fashion, the temple or the different columns of what the FDA is trying to accomplish. And on the base, that is the foundation of this temple, has a regulatory science definition. I get to that in a second. But these different columns that you see on the right, they have very, very broad-ranging aims. Things like, to modernize, the development and evaluation of FDA-regulated products. You would need to know what are FDA-regulated products. What does modernized development mean when you're a regulator, which is fundamentally different than, bringing something to market. It is the development and the evaluation of those tools before they get to the market. So each one of these words here comes with a plethora of documents and aims and goals. So it's very, very tough to bridge this and that. But ultimately, when you look at the value proposition of bringing this together, the gap is basically how can people, we need to define them, let's say with severe disabilities, benefit from this in a safe and effective manner so that it's not just someone doing something and then failing and then redoing it until maybe at one point a product comes out that you can rely upon. That is, in large oversimplification, the purpose of this. Now, this is very, very complex to decipher. And if we take this definition and look at it in a little more, or in a little closer way, so the regulation that we try to work with is actually trying to do the following, like developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety and efficacy, quality and performance of FDA-regulated products. This is a little more concrete, but what these tools are, what these standards are for this field remains to be determined. So that's the purpose of at least approaching this. And if we contrast this with a more practical definition of what we try to do, and keep in mind, this is not an FDA definition, this is something that we came up with, it is that this may also imply that we apply the scientific method to challenge some of these rules. Now, maybe some folks in the FDA might not like to hear this because once regulations are made, they shouldn't be challenged, they should be complied with. But of course, not every single rule is perfect as it's made. So you need to adopt it. You see, for example, when new draft guidances are released, the agency by statute requests a comment period. And during that comment period, we can provide input. Now, we shouldn't provide input by saying we challenge this, right? I put this here because it's very placative and catchy, but we should work with the FDA to improve them. But if we have scientific data to show that a certain regulation really doesn't work, that would be something where the word challenge here might be applicable. So in other words, collaborative communities provide a medium, a forum, a platform, just like this, where people come together to use science to potentially influence regulation to be better. And that was sort of the first of the 4 points I wanted to make. To be a little more practical, what does that look like and how do we approach this? The first part, whenever you encounter a problem with regulation, it might be your traffic ticket, it might be a legal scenario with your partner. I hope no one has that. But the first part you have to do is assess the landscape that you're acting in. So let's say a regulatory landscape analysis, what would that look like for this topic here? I think you've seen the cover of one of the guidance documents before, and I want to use that as well, but I want to explain what some of the work groups that we have initiated will actually do, just as an example. So the guidance document itself has a content. That content hopefully provides most of the relevant aspects for a given question. It can, by definition, not entail anything and everything. So if you have a question, can we use our action potential tracing as CSV or as TSV, and you want to know from the FDA, should we use CSV or TSV files, that is definitely not going to be in a guidance document, because the context matters and would likely determine which might be the best format for tracking certain data. And then comes the regulatory input of whether that makes sense or not. So the more specific a question gets, the less informative a guidance document is. So that raises the question, well, what is a regulatory landscape analysis then? So when you have read this document, or when you will read the document, you will find that at certain sections in the text or as footnotes, very complicated what the difference is, but they will map to other documents. I listed 4 here just as an example. So one is about radio frequency wireless technology in medical devices. Now, if you work without wireless devices, that guidance document, a separate guidance document, might not be applicable to you. But if you work with Wi-Fi technology, it is applicable to you. Similarly, there are requests for feedbacks on Q submission. Well, what's a Q submission? That has nothing to do with the technology. That is, if you have a question, there's an entire separate guidance document on how to ask a question. There might be things like, the voluntary use of standards. So if you, let's say, pick an example in diagnostics and radiology, you might use DICOM as an image standard, and data standards around BCIs are currently emerging. So the question is, how does a standard become FDA recognized? Separate guidance document. And there's one, for example, when you use off-the-shelf software. So these are just 4 examples of how your technology in one guidance document might map to other guidance documents. And when you take that to the point where it encompasses to a reasonable extent, let's say most, if not all, of the regulatory applicable guidances, that you could frame that as the guidance framework. What that looks like for a different field is, and this took about, just to give you an idea, about 60 to 70 hours to put together. in this case for a device called digital pathology, which is a slide scanner basically. This is the regulatory landscape that was captured in 2021 that goes back, to some very old documents to just account for all kinds of stuff. And some of the points, the questions that Lee put on one slide, for example, related to cybersecurity, that is by no means something new to the agency. If you look, for example, just on cybersecurity, there are at least, I think there's actually 2 more documents now past 2020. In short, this landscape analysis will be, I hope, one of the outputs from the iBCI-CC community that will be, of course, one, illustrating that this is not just one document, and it is not possible to summarize an entire field in its all regulations in one recipe, in one cookbook. That's impossible. Second is, there will be some historic aspects that might need revision. So the BCI field, since what was the guidance on 2021, right? That has moved on, so we need an update. We need patience to work through this. It's not, easy to read through these documents, but it will form a very important resource. If someone has a question and can trace it back in this landscape, it might be very useful. Third point, a unifying language. And it is clear that when you have a pre-market authorization, that there's a certain additional quality stamp behind it. So it comes with a certain credibility by basically having undergone peer review, which might be a better approach to describe what the FDA does, but in a very thorough fashion, collaboratively with multiple meetings. So ultimately what that means is if you have, let's say, an AI tool or a certain medical application and you add regulatory science to it, the benefit might be higher, but what does that mean? It means that you have to fulfill certain descriptions that are not intuitive. Let's say some folks might call an AI algorithm. What is the function of that? Well, the function by itself, you could use the word function in many, many different ways. In regulatory science, there are certain concepts, for example, the intended use or the indication of use, meaning for who and why is this being used. But there are also terms like mitigation measures or certain other terms, they all need to be defined. This is not just theoretical. What those terms actually lead to, and I'm skipping over, let's say, 1 year of review, is that in certain so-called decision summaries, another regulatory term, this is not just a summary that says yes approved or not approved. It is a summary of all these terms throughout the actual regulatory process that is combined then, and you see things like indication for use, how that's written. Of course, this is a separate, different device, and it will define which type of approval it is. 510K, is it de novo or is it not? Is it a pre-market authorization, etc.? All these terms have very specific meanings, and it's extremely important to know this. How can a collaborative community contribute to this? If a device authorization happened, this year is the first AI tool in pathology that's a landmark sort of approval. And we, in the other collaborative community, did a session where we invited a researcher from, I think, Mayo Clinic, and then the company that got the approval, as well as the FDA, to jointly present this decision summary. And people asked a lot of questions, and we put this is publicly available, including a recording of that presentation available on the website, where jointly a researcher, the industry representative, as well as the FDA, provided their input of what this decision summary, this approval accomplished and what it didn't accomplish. So this is an output, a fairly unique output. So this is, if you want to call it formalistically, a YouTube video on a website with a frequently asked question page. I don't know what formally that would mean. Some people would probably call it a blog, but it's a little bit more than just someone putting a blog out there. It was prepared, it was cross-reviewed, the FDA looked at it, it was okay with the information on the website. So this is an exemplary output of a collaborative community. And this slide that Lee showed earlier, I challenge you now, where would you put this output? What do you think? Is it more like a white paper or publication, or is it education and training? Of course, it's publicly available. So if someone asks, hey, Joe, what does a decision summary look like? I can take that link, send it to someone and say, here's a webinar that was co-joined by the FDA that explains what a decision summary is. It's a resource. I don't know what to call it, but so the collaborative community defines which outputs are available. There are also formal programs within the agency that would allow to even register and authorize certain tools, for example, data sets or certain processes. That's the third part. And the last part is a little bit of a mnemonic, or a little bit, let's say, a help to get the view of the regulator. And I'm trying to use a diamond to illustrate this. So as we discuss things later today, there are many, many different facets, different vantage points that you might want to take into account. Industry, academia, regulator, patient, advocacy group, professional society. And each one of these facets has a different sort of purpose. And I wanted to use the exhibit of a diamond to illustrate these different vantage points. And it is a bit of an analogy and a bit of a stretch, so I hope you give me some leeway here. But if you have time, the Smithsonian exhibits this so-called Hope Diamond, very rare sapphire diamond. When you go there, there's a certain security around it. Then there's a certain authorization certificate near the diamond that proves its authenticity. When you look at it, it serves a certain purpose, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to say is, as we discuss certain topics today, you might take whatever the ring from Grace Kelly as another example, that there are certain things that might be a great user experience. So for those who like diamonds, that might be fantastic. It might feel great. So the user experience is certainly one aspect that's important. Whether durability and longevity, which is a completely different dimension of looking at something, is there. Well, a diamond might hold longer, is more firm than, some gemstone, etc. The efficacy and performance is like, does the light shine through there specifically? It's great that the Hope Diamond helped, for example, decipher through its light reflecting properties how a sapphire and a diamond are formed. Safety and biocompatibility is one vantage point that the FDA always looks at. And if you're allergic to silver and the embracement of the diamond would cause some allergy, that might not be biocompatible. Of course, regulatory compliance, I mentioned the certificate that's sitting there. Clinical outcomes, I think you get the point, like this is where the analogy falls a bit apart, but the sparkle might be something here. And then, the data security and privacy, I mentioned already this, encasing, you could maybe think about it. So I'm just trying to use this analogy to illustrate when you look at things from a regulator's perspective, and we talk only about one specific element, that's fine to define it, but overall, sort of a more holistic approach is, in other words, the purpose of regulatory science. So with those 4 points, collaborative communities address a gap. The second is that we have to do certain analyses. One is a regulatory landscape analysis. The third is we need to learn the regulatory science language. And then the fourth, the hope of instilling sort of the different vantage points in you is sort of the hope and the shared purpose of today's meeting and the workshops. So with that, I give you here my email address, and if there's questions, of course, I'll be here. And thank you very much for having me.
There we go. All right, so we have made it to the Q&A section of our first annual public meeting of the iBCI-CC. Just a few things to check and to make sure the Q&A side of Zoom, looking at Jessica and Beth, is up and working, and folks in the back seem to agree that it is. Jake, Jake Guzman is right there. Thank you. Jake, you'll have a microphone handed to you in just a moment but not that one. There's a microphone right there. You'll have another microphone. Jake is an amazing PhD student in my lab, looking at the anthropomorphicity of neural activity and the control of soft robotic wearable robotics from iBCIs. And so I broke every rule in the PhD mentor book. And towards the end of somebody's PhD, I said, hey, Jake, can you fly to DC and be the person that makes sure everybody has a mic? And of course, he had absolutely no chance to say, no, I want to finish my thesis. He just did what his mentor asked. So I apologize for breaking every mentorship rule by asking you to do that, but I'm very glad that you're here, and thank you for doing so. And I should just note as well, thank you, Joe. I think there's a feeling of having just concluded a visit to our collective house of worship in regulatory science. Your presentation learned a lot, as always, and those some of those tidbits, some of those takeaways really do inform the very content-focused, outcomes-focused approach of each of our work groups. So we're going to alternate as best we can. This is a chance for the folks that are here, the folks that are online, and anybody else in the public who may be online or in the room to ask questions about the iBCI-CC. I will say that we have representatives from FDA, from NIH, from CMS, from Commerce. I feel like I missed at least one federal agency who may be represented here. Just let me say on behalf of all of them, they are wonderfully here to participate, to contribute to the discussion. None of their comments should be construed as the policy of the federal government or of their agency, unless they say so otherwise. We are all here to learn together and to contribute to this collaborative community. So encourage everybody to ask questions of anybody else who is here. I'll do my best to field questions, and I may be looking to people either online or in the room to provide answers. And with that, I think we will just begin to take questions. Feel free to approach the mic, raise a hand, have a mic.
I'm just gonna jump
Yes,
in real
please.
quick. Yeah, so just logistically, how we would like this to work. We do have a standing mic in the middle of the room that you can line up behind to ask your questions. Our reason for doing this is we would like to make sure we involve the virtual attendees as much as possible, and we do have a camera on the mic. So not to put you in the spotlight, but we just want to make sure that it is a good experience for our virtual attendees too. So please line up there if you can. If it is difficult for you to get to the mic, Jake will run the mic to you, and Jake will also run the mic if Lee spontaneously requests someone in the audience to answer a question, and you're not expecting to be at a mic, Jake will run it over to you. And then for those who are virtually attending, you can use the Q&A box on Zoom in order to submit a question, and I will read it out loud, and we'll alternate between in-person and virtual. All right.
Tom, I'll let you introduce yourself. Tom, please.
Thanks, Lee. Is that working? Hello. Tom Oxley here from Synchron. Thank you. This is very exciting. Everything's been incredibly organized, and it's very exciting to see this come together. Lee, you mentioned, I just wanted to raise an opinion and get feeling from everyone and get your thoughts around the topic of BCI and neuromodulation, and how we think about definitions and what this group's here to do. And you said that a closed loop afferent neuromodulation is the same as a BCI. I don't think it is. I think I can see how Eddie Chang says that as well. I can see how they're very similar, but I think the definition of BCI has that extra component of connecting to an external system to provide a certain function. In the guidance document, the FDA used the term neuroprosthesis, and I think we're here doing medical device development, and I think the concept of a neuroprosthesis becomes really relevant, primarily heading towards CMS and reimbursement. And so I just wanted to raise the point that if we start to include neuromodulation, and so when I think about, if you think about a BCI as a neuroprosthesis, then it's a device that restores a lost brain function, like typically a cortical function, but an actual bodily function that's defined in the ICD. Whereas a neuromodulation device, and so you can have a stimulation arm in a BCI, like for instance, stimulation of sensory to provide haptic feedback because you're serving the purpose of restored sensory motor function, which is a lost bodily function. For neuromodulation, stimulation is typically to like disrupt or jam an abnormal signal that resolves a pathological symptom of a disease. So what I worry about is as we enter into conversations with CMS, if we broaden BCI to include neuromodulation, from a CMS perspective, they're like, oh, okay, now we're making a decision about a much bigger thing. So I'm a little bit protective around BCI being neuroprosthesis and heading into a CMS conversation because I don't want to have CMS concerned that this grows into a much larger decision where the decisions they make have a much bigger economic impact than what if it's just for this new, and also there already is a CMS pathway for neuromodulation and there's not one clearly for this field. So I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on that.
Yeah, Tom, thanks very much. I think in many ways, this really important discussion comes down to being precise about our definitions, and all of these definitions may be somewhat arbitrary, but I agree completely that if we're not precise about them, then when we engage with any number of our regulatory partners, we will have challenges ahead. I heard your definition of neuromodulation, and I think it's one that many share. When I think about stimulating the cervical spinal cord in order to reanimate upper limb movement, and the ways that those may be driven by a recording device in the brain, is that effector part, is that a neuromodulation device that's modulating the nervous system, or do we want to exclude that? And I'm not just agreeing with you, I'm just seeking definitions that we all agree with so that when I or anybody else claims that a BCI is an afferent limb of a closed loop neuromodulation device, are we wrong? Should we not say that? It's a question.
I was just thinking the same thing, and I think vagal nerve stimulation for stroke recovery, you could also argue, well, that's restoring a function, but the way I think about it is you're stimulating away a pathological symptom, which in that case is generally to do with spasticity, because you're like reducing. So yeah, it's definitely on the edge. Like that's where I think it gets a bit, nothing's going to be a perfect definition. So I guess the main point I was making was, can we elevate neuroprosthesis as a term in this community? Because I think BCI can generate more, anyway. So.
Yeah, undoubtedly, and really a valuable term is defined in a couple places. That's great. Thanks, Tom. Did other people, yes, I was about to say, does anybody have any thoughts on that? And David.
Yeah, so maybe just a comment on this. As I showed on the office org chart for OHC5, there's a vast number of teams. We have 8 teams now. There's many different medical device areas, and we love all of our children equally. And so I wouldn't say that this is purely exclusionary, as Lee highlighted. This is the first clinical neuroscience collaborative community. It by no means needs to be the last. So if there are folks that are out there that might feel that their type of device doesn't fit this, DBS is a very large established area, but still has plenty of challenges. We recently had a National Academies meeting focused. How do we get DBS to be standard of care? Even for the most well-established therapies, it's highly underutilized. And so there are profound challenges in other areas and new exciting technologies in terms of steerable currents and adaptive technologies. So there's room for other collaborative communities. If that is something that the community is interested in, we can talk about that, but there is some value in defining exactly what this is.
Just one more point. The BCI Society just ran a process on a definition, which you're involved with, Lee, but it might be interesting to share that in this forum as well. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it just in the recent weeks it got released.
Yes, yeah, the BCI Society, which is for those who don't know, is at bcisociety.org, if I remember correctly. It recently requested or sent out a survey to its many hundreds of members to try to get feedback on how the BCI Society should define a BCI, and that is worth looking at. And I think as we compare definitions, that will undoubtedly be useful. We, of course, here added an I before BCI. That is, so we're very very carefully trying to constrain all of the efforts in this room, at least on this topic, to implantable BCIs. So we may have some difference in definitions, but yeah, again, that definition evolved from the feedback of many, many people. Thanks. Melanie, and then online, please.
Was there a virtual person who needed to go in between me?
You just won, but the virtual person will be next.
Okay. I'm Melanie Friedo, and I also had a question about definitions, so thank you for starting that, Tom. In the definition that you put up, it was for rehabilitation or restoration. It was not for establishment. So you're not including individuals with a developmental challenge who have not experienced speech or whatever form of communication, just for those with acquired impairments?
The rhetorical tone in your voice is outstanding. Thank you. So you're right, it's definitely not up there, and I personally would be thrilled to see a work group that is focused on exactly that so that we can broaden the definition. There has been so little consideration, even with the few meetings that you and I and others have been in, to think about how this extraordinary group of evolving devices may be able to provide for the first time functions that were not there at birth due to either inborn errors of metabolism or utero injury or disease, or even an early childhood injury. Any of these events could lead to a function that is not fully developed, as it might have been for somebody with typical development. And there is a good chance that the devices being created by the folks in this room and the research being done by the folks in this room could lead to devices that provide for the first time some of these functions. I think that would be great. And if indeed there's sufficient will amongst the group to perhaps have a work group focused on that, then I think that would be the moment to expand our definition. Thanks so much. Just before we go, any other thoughts on that really important topic? And just to say out loud, we are also therefore then talking about children and no longer solely about adults in this community, if in fact there's a work group that focuses on that. Any other thoughts in that realm? All right, Jessica will start throwing things at me if I don't go next to the folks online.
Yes,
Please.
so we'd like to give a chance to the folks online. And I apologize in advance, or I'll just put out a disclaimer that I may not pronounce all the names correctly, but I'll do my best. So we have a question from Naja Beckel. They say, with regards to work efforts and output, I see partial overlap with efforts from adjacent communities and platforms, such as the NIH Brain Initiative, Human Brain Project, Open Mind, et cetera. How do you interact and align with those efforts? Is there any unmet need? Is there an unmet need currently to unify?
Yeah, thanks for that great question. So there's a couple of ways that we interact with any of the other forums, agencies, groups that are thinking about similar and overlapping issues. I will say that this very carefully structured collaborative community has protection to have the kinds of open conversations that could lead to building consensus that could possibly inform regulatory insight down in the future. I think I was able to keep that general enough to not misspeak. But we have a unique opportunity to achieve some things in the collaborative community that might not be able to be achieved by some of the entities that were just listed. Having said that, several of those entities that were just listed have people in the room here now who are engaging in the collaborative community. Nobody here has any interest in actually duplicating work that is being done brilliantly elsewhere, unless there's a particular advantage to having some of those discussions here and having the specific outputs come from the collaborative community. On the other hand, if there are great teams of people who are thinking about some of these issues in ways that should be part of the collaborative community, we welcome you. Please join us and provide that guidance. And I'm sure nobody here will hesitate to say, oh, wait, there's another group that's really got this. Let them come in and educate us. And maybe that's not something specific that we need to focus on. I think the one other thought is that there may be more than one opinion on how to answer any of the questions that are being addressed by any of the other either societies or agencies or groups that are just mentioned. And this is a chance in this unique collaborative community environment to provide that alternate opinion and to try to reach a consensus. So I think that was part one, and part two was, as I recall.
Is there an unmet need to unify?
Yes, there are many, many unmet needs. One of them was just mentioned. I don't know where Melanie just went. There's no shortage of unmet needs. And I hope that what will happen is that those unmet needs will be raised in the individual work groups. Some of them will become projects that have outputs that become subsequently public. There will be unmet needs that are recognized that perhaps Work Group A feels that Work Group B should be looking at this, can send it over, or that we collectively discuss to create a new work group. There is a structure here, and yeah, we are by no means limited to what we've set ourselves up for at the moment, and the structure and the work groups that we've started off with, but there's lots of other opportunities.
Great.
Please.
Hello, Anna Wexler, University of Pennsylvania. This was a great background on the setup of the iBCI-CC and the goals. So I'm thinking sort of 5 years ahead. This is a tricky question, but what do we think success would look like looking back? Like, what are the outcomes or deliverables that would make us look back and think this is successful? And then kind of a related question, I'm also wondering how collaborative communities sort of peter out. Like, what's the end of a collaborative community? Is there some sort of endpoint after which it sort of peters out? So.
Yes. So, thank you, Anna, who's esteemed ethicist, by the way, bioethicist. To your second question first, which was one that I think David had raised earlier, may have actually been either Julia or Heather. It was Heather, yes, about the end of a collaborative community. So I think that we will be able to conclude this collaborative community when every person in the world who could benefit and wants an implantable brain-computer interface has one, has received it in an ethical manner and in an equitable manner, and is benefiting from it. We might close down a little earlier than that, but that is an aspirational goal that is clearly well out. In a shorter time span than when we get there, there are any number of devices that right now are either in early clinical trials or about to be in clinical trials or at the bench and are thinking about how can they get to their initial clinical trials. If I take off science and regulatory and administrative hat on and I put just the doc hat on, the next time I see a patient who just lost the ability to move or just lost the ability to speak in the ICU, I want to say, I'm sorry that this happened, but there are 5 technologies that could potentially help you. Here's the description. They're available, and you can have them tomorrow, and they'll work. That would be a success for the field, and I think that this collaborative community can speed the path for not only the academics and scientists and engineers, but importantly for the companies who are the absolutely critical final mile, and it may be described as final hundreds of miles, but last critical step, because as we all know, it is not our academic medical centers or our universities that create the final form of these devices. It, at least in the US, are the companies that will create the final form of these devices, submit them for pre-market approval or other regulatory clearance, and eventually make them available to the folks who could benefit. So I do think that within 5 years, we'll begin to see some of those, and I have great confidence that the confidence with which they can get to that goal will be informed by the discussions that are held here in the collaborative community. Thanks. Jessica's in charge.
I'm going to try and continue alternating. Okay. All right, so we have a question from Srikanth Mahankali. As a domain futurist, what would you consider the key upcoming trends at the intersection of emerging technologies with iBCIs? What key policy considerations are immediately on the anvil over the next couple of years?
Is there anybody in the room that considers themselves a domain futurist who would be willing to answer this question? Come on. Jake, hand the mic to somebody. There's a lot to unpack there. Tom, did I see you begin to stand? Thank you, Tom. All right, good.
That sounds like a transhumanist type question. So I don't know if this is the forum to get into transhumanist futurist type approaches. So it's interesting. I think it does beg a question. Like, I know there are various, I think it gets into neuroethics around, where does the technology get to at that point at which there's going beyond human levels of function and what that's going to mean for the field. I think we're going to have to deal with that at some point. I don't think we're dealing with that right now. And I think right now we're building out safety and efficacy for a set of patients that have needs, but it probably is, reasonable to think that that precipice is out ahead of us, and we probably should think about what it means to cross it. And because certainly culture and, it's a science fiction domain, it's a transhumanist philosophy, it's something that's out there that we have to deal with. I don't have any answers about it.
Yeah, thank you for building that bridge, Tom. I think that it is important for this group to think about the implications, the ethical, moral implications, cultural implications of the technologies that are being developed here. There are experts in the room thinking about that and helping the rest of us to think deeply about that. Also, to Tom's point, we do try to establish a scope and boundaries, and I think just really to focus our efforts. And I think, as just described, while thinking about what those implications are and thinking about how these devices will become available, it's useful for at least this group to limit its scope at the moment for what might classically be considered a medical, unquote, need that will be filled and a function that will be either restored or rehabilitated or enabled for the first time through these technologies for people who may benefit. Thank you.
Just to clarify, it sounded like the question was about interactions with other technologies, like maybe AI and other tools and stuff like that. So just to, it seemed like that's sort of what the question was getting at it. And
all right. You want to get your degree, right? Thank you, Jake. I mean, this was mentioned before, there are really important overlaps between this field, the decoders that we're using, which undoubtedly are benefiting from machine learning and AI approaches, and how these technologies may overlap. And we do need to build bridges. There are experts in this room in those approaches. And I think that continuing this discussion is undoubtedly really important, again, with the focus on restoring, rehabilitating, or enabling. Thanks. Please.
Hi, thanks so much for putting this together. This is Devjani Shah from MICRA. So I wanted to ask regarding peripheral nervous system. I mean, I might have missed it, but just curious if that's included in iBCI. I think it was considered part of the BCI guidance. So just curious if that's included or if that's a future consideration.
Thanks. I think this is really up to the group. Most of the discussion has been about recording from the brain and from the central nervous system. There hasn't been as much discussion yet about recording and decoding from the peripheral nervous system. There are many of the topics that we're discussing are still relevant in recording from the peripheral nervous system. I don't think there's anything that we've said that excludes that from being within our scope. If that is of interest to groups of people who are here, we should think about either a work group or a project based in one of the work groups to really further develop what those look like, maybe how they differ from any number of regulatory standpoints from devices that would be put in the brain as opposed to recording either in some implanted way. We're going to keep the iBCI. But I think the more that we learn about those where there hasn't been quite as much thought will be valuable. So yeah, thanks for raising.
All right, we have a question from Tamami Fukushi. How about the relationship with IMDRF now and strategic plan regarding future collaboration?
Not too proud to admit that somebody's got to define IMDRF for me.
So I would say I'm also not the CDRH international expert, but IMDRF is the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, I believe, and CDRH is co-leading that this year. Our former director, Jeff Shuren, is doing that, and it is happening, as Gabriella just pointed out, in Seattle right now. So I would say in internally in FDA, in CDRH, we are well aware of these efforts. And as mentioned before, we are working with international regulatory partners to have conversations on this. And we can certainly, increase awareness, their awareness at the iBCI-CC in terms of collaborating. And there might be folks online who've joined from the international colleagues. We haven't had a specific BCI-focused session at an IMDRF meeting to date. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but I would say that some of the issues discussed there are the cross-device type of questions on cybersecurity, on biocompatibility, and the like. So, happy to have further discussions on how CDRH International and the international regulators can be involved in these efforts and what are the best venues for those to occur.
That's great. Thanks, David. And just to add to that, now being educated on IMDRF, so thank you both for the question and for the answer. There was a question early on of can international entities, whether they be companies, academics, or otherwise engage in the iBCI-CC? The answer is absolutely yes. We have started initially with a focus on regulatory questions that are particularly, relevant here in the US, but realizing that the successful corporate ventures will likely be making their devices available outside of the US. It's important for us to be thinking about how these systems may find their way outside the borders of the US. And undoubtedly, there are companies that are based elsewhere who also want to be making their devices, hopefully safe and effective devices, available here in the U.S. So this is by no means limited to our borders. So please, from the international community, do join us, help to educate each other, and be all that much more likely that these devices will be of greater value to so many more people in the future. You're right up to the mic. Just one question on time. We're going to, we have 9 minutes. Plenty of time, please.
Perfect. Hi, Charles Greenspan, University of Chicago. I wanted to get your stance on, from a collaborative community perspective, it's about allowing other people to join the field and work together. But one of the largest hurdles is IDEs and IRBs, right? And I wanted to know if there's an appetite at all for sort of like fostering, new people getting those, people working together so that that language is more simplified, easier to share across groups, easier to work with the FDA and other regulatory bodies, and so on and so forth.
Thank you for the question. I will see if anybody from FDA wants to respond directly to the description of the IDEs. I will. Let me start with the IRB question. There are a range of IRBs throughout the U.S., both ones at universities, academic medical centers, and private ones. There's a range of expertise in those IRBs. There's a range of experience with novel devices. There's a range of experience with novel implanted neurologic devices. And it's probably more than we can expect that every IRB will have sufficient expertise and be able to bring in sufficient expertise to really provide the expert and thoughtful answers that one always wants. I've been very lucky to work with IRBs that provide that on a regular basis. So my personal experience has always been good, and I have gained from the insights of our IRBs repeatedly over 20 years. But I know that that is not a universal sentiment. I think that one of the things that the iBCI-CC could do is to provide a method for educating IRBs on the unique aspects of this field. What do those work products look like? How can we actually be helpful so that the feedback that you're all getting, or many of you are getting when you're submitting things to your local IRBs, are on point and can facilitate the outcomes that we're all looking for, which is careful, ethical, rigorous research that leads to answers that advance the field. I will see if there's yes.
Yeah. So just two quick points. So, the formal FDA answer, come talk to us, pre-subs, Q-subs, we're willing to work with you. That's part of the Breakthrough Designation TAP programs, is to really work with innovators in the space. But as mentioned in a question earlier today, the Open Mind Consortium is a NIH Brain Initiative funded group. And so recommend, Googling that right now, pulling it up. They do share resources. They share IDEs. They share knowledge in that group. And, as brought up before, DVS, they were primarily focused in the DVS space, looking at adaptive DVS, but I believe they have BCI represented there as well. So in terms of getting those documents, having shared learnings, that's certainly a good group to look at.
I'm also with FDA, and to jump on what David said, I also wanted to identify an opportunity for public and patient engagement that's coming up here in the fall. I believe the date was recently announced for October 30th, if I'm not mistaken, but FDA is hosting a patient engagement advisory committee on the topic of informed consent. It's going to be focused on patient perspectives, but obviously informed consent is a foundational component of both IRB and IDE approval, and we are seeking to broaden our perspectives in terms of the key information that needs to be included to really address the risks, benefits, and all information that would inform who's going to be participating, who it serves, and what influences their decisions. So I'm happy to provide more information about that, but there is a Federal Register notice and an executive summary already published on the FDA site, and yeah, feel free to follow up with me for more info.
Great. Thanks, Zach. All right, we have, my job is to keep us on time. We have 5 minutes. Yes, right in the back.
Just
Yeah,
a super quick follow-up on the previous question. If anybody does have questions about OpenMind and the resources that are available there, examples of regulatory documentation. My name's Heather Dawes. Please feel free to stop by and ask me about that today at the meeting. Happy to talk.
Yes, excellent. Thanks, Heather. And I'll just, disclosure, I'm on the advisory team for OpenMind, and it really is a wonderful group that's been thinking deeply about DBS and open source and software, and how does this really continue as such an important technology. Good, just a few minutes left. Are we in the room or are we on Zoom?
I think the last one was in the room, so
okay.
Zoom next. This is from Srikranth Mahankali. What potential tools, resources, training, and education pathways exist for those transitioning and making their way into this space?
Yeah, so this field can't wait to have yet another great generation of scientists and engineers and ethicists and clinicians. The pathway for some is clear. The pathway for others has yet to be established. We need to figure out, and one of the things that I hope this collaborative community can do, not only think about clinical practice guidelines, but thinking about how do we ensure that our next generation of researchers and engineers and the folks who are developing and leading the companies in this implantable BCI space know everything that they need to know, learn it early, have a chance to contribute as early as possible. So I think it's a great opportunity for this collaborative community to think about how we would achieve that. All right, in the room, Rob.
Hi, I'm Rob Franklin. Just wanted to ask a question to you, but also to the rest of the community. Like, have we really thought through what does success look like in 2 to 3 years, and how are we going to measure our progress towards that success? Maybe it's the number of projects completed that we initiated, maybe it's something else, but do we have any key performance indicators or other things that we're going to use to measure our progress towards what we want to accomplish?
Key question, we need a way to measure our own success. Our success will be, or lack of such, could be either, hopefully it's our success, will be reviewed annually by the signatories of the iBCI-CC. Our output are from those projects. We want to see some of them get to completion, hopefully within the next 6 months, so that we have clear outputs in this first year. As Jessica was describing earlier, even this important but purposefully nebulous initial project on creating a glossary, that will be step one. There are some real urgent questions that need to be answered, and it's up to the work groups to prioritize them. But I do think the number, the quality, peer review when appropriate of those projects, and the feedback that we get from our federal partners on whether this group is contributing in a meaningful way to speed the ever better iBCIs finding their way through the pathway to becoming available in a wide and equitable way. That's part of how we'll define our own success. But you're absolutely right. I think the more precise that we can do that, the better. It also gives us things to aim for. Thanks, Rob. I think we have time for one more question. It's up to, we're gonna stick in the room. It's up to Jessica.
There is one more question in the chat. Okay, it is not an easy question to answer, and it is an important topic in the work groups to discuss. So maybe we can just acknowledge it and then quickly do last question here.
Please.
Okay. So Eli Kinney Lang asked, in the history portion you highlighted the many companies which have developed in the past 10 years looking at iBCIs. What are considerations and safeguards for long-term support of these implantable systems if those companies fail or leave the market?
Yeah, I mentioned briefly earlier, critically important, and there are examples, broadly speaking, in implanted technologies that many of us are familiar with companies winding down in a number of ways, not being able to adequately support for some period of time their products. And the same is true even for the academic research. How do we make sure that devices that are proving to be of value to individuals who have them, who engage in the academic research, can continue to benefit from those devices, at least from their own standpoint, benefit from those devices at the end of any given project, which from a federal funding standpoint is when the dollars stop for that project. These are open questions. They're one that are important to resolve in any number of ways, and it is part of what our work groups will be focusing on. All right. Last question for the Q&A section, please.
Awesome. So I'm Sam from the project UCAT. We work on iBCI applications. And there was the topic of artificial intelligence was brought up earlier. I wanted to ask it repeatedly here because I'm trying to identify whether that is a kind of a concern or a topic that the iBCI-CC is also investigating. As you know, with artificial intelligence, deep learning in particular is increasingly kind of adopted in the decoders of motor behavior from neural data. And they will effectively, these deep learning models, be shipped alongside the solutions from various BCI manufacturers. Yet the lack of interpretability of these deep learning models is quite an ethical concern because sometimes they will provide predictions that do not necessarily agree with what the user intended to do. So, this can have initial problems of false speech output, and we've seen that the first generation of these speech decoders were, at 20% word error rate, and now they're getting better. But deep learning models will be applied to also arm and maybe wheelchair control in the future as well as applications become more mature, maybe robotic control. So who really is liable for the bad decisions that artificial intelligence systems make? And are we concerned as iBCI-CC members to answer that question?
I think as a community, thank you for your question, Sam. It is one that has come up on multiple occasions and will continue to. One way to think about where the AI ML contribution to the block diagram appears is to focus again on safety and efficacy. Many of the things that you raised are question the extent to which those tools will enable efficacy and may raise flags for safety. Through those goggles, I think we're going to be able to focus ever better on these developing tools, how they can be integrated as they already are to any number of implantable BCIs, either, which are all investigational at the moment, and how we as a community think about applying those in these technologies. There are other regulations that are available. There's other guidance documents that begin and other groups that are looking at this as well. And as a community, we just need to engage in those discussions. And I think you raised some really valid points that are being discussed and perhaps could be even focused on a little bit more. So thank you. And with that, I want to bring to a close our first annual question and answer period for the iBCI-CC. That was really, I think, informative. Hopefully, everybody here would learn a little bit something. I certainly learned plenty. We will now take a 10-minute break. So at 11:12, sound right? We will return for our keynote address. If you're here in the room, please grab some coffee and anything else that's back there. If you're online, please take a break as well, and we'll be back here in 10 minutes. Thanks. Today, as you know, is our first inaugural, somewhat redundant, implantable BCI collaborative community meeting. And one of the things we really wanted to do was to have a keynote speaker who could educate all of us and to educate all of us from a slightly different perspective. So it is really a lot of fun for me to introduce the inaugural keynote speaker of the iBCI-CC annual meeting, Dr. Raul Nogueira. I've really had the great privilege of knowing Raul since we were residents, Raul being a year ahead of me, which means I've been able to learn from him basically every day since I started as a neurology resident and continued through my career. The program book has some of his many accolades, starting in Brazil, trained in neurology, then at the Mass General Brigham, also trained in stroke and neurocritical care, and subsequently in neurointerventional surgery. He is truly a triple or quadruple threat. If we add his teaching and authorship, he is a quintuple plus threat. He is somebody who has been, even from the earliest days, I knew Raul as somebody who would meet a patient, recognize that there was a problem that needed to be solved, and would solve it, and would not stop until that problem was solved, however it needed to be solved, with not only tremendous diagnostic acumen, but just a will to look at the available data, to look at what should be done, regardless of the very small amount of available data that might inform our collective decision-making, and then just to make the right decision over and over again. We've asked Raul to be here after his training, went to Emory and then to UPMC, where he is endowed professor and division chief of cerebrovascular medicine. Not really to talk about brain-computer interfaces, perhaps towards the end, but to share his perspective on what in many ways is a very similar event for the field of thrombectomy for acute stroke, of a new device and a new approach to treating a particular neurologic event, the path that it took and its path to success and some of the bumps along the way. So really a pleasure for me to welcome, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Dr. Raul Nogueira.
Thank you, Lee, for the kind words. It's a true honor to be here. This is a field that I share a lot of passion for. I'm gonna talk about my first main profession, academic passion, which is the mechanical clot removal to treat strokes. This has been an amazing journey. When I started my career as a young clinician trialist, I had very ambitious hope for what a clot removal procedure could become. I can tell you that those hopes have been surpassed in what you see now in clinical practice. So it's a beautiful story that I want to share with you, but the reason I want to do so is to share that it's had a lot of bumps and challenges, and I was hearing from colleagues that were pointing out these problems. You went through this. And I think the problem that you face now, it's a lot more complex than just the plumbing problem that you dealt with, but I'll try to share what you learned along that journey with you. So here are my disclosures. I do a lot of device trials and clinical trials in general. In terms of brain-computer interface, I have been a safety monitor for the SWITCH trial and also an operator in the COMMAND trial. So I have had some hands-on experience with BCI myself. I think this is your living science fiction, and it is a big hope to help millions and millions of patients. So congratulations to all of you who are here in this very important work. I'm gonna shift from paralysis, which I think it's probably your first main target, to stroke. It shares the same facet that it's a huge problem. Have 13 million new strokes every year, 5.5 million deaths worldwide, with 26 million people living with disability due to stroke. It is the number 2 cause of global death, and it is the number 3 cause for overall disease burden in society. It's also the number 3 reason for healthcare financial burden. And when you look at nursing care and hospitalization, it actually surpasses almost any other condition. Starting with the basics, I understand that we have a very broad audience here. So what is a stroke? There are 2 types of strokes. 85% of them are what you call ischemic strokes. It's essentially a clogged pipe. It's a blood clot or a cholesterol plaque, you call atheroma, blocks a blood vessel. There is no blood supply to the brain. A piece of the brain dies because there is no oxygen, no brain food. 15% of the strokes are you call hemorrhagic or bleeding strokes. We are not gonna be talking about them. So typically you have the clogged pipe because you have a traveling clot. You call that an embolus, so you may hear the term embolectomy. Typically comes from the heart or the carotid artery in the neck, travels to the brain, blocks the vessel. Less common, this is actually a lot more common the case when you have the situation with cardiology, when you have a heart attack, where you have an atheroma, which is the cholesterol plaque that progresses and blocks the blood vessel. But physiology, what happens when you have the occlusion of a blood vessel is you have this yellow wedge, okay, where you don't have brain perfusion, that area of the brain will die, and this process happens over time. At any point in time, you have this red area, you call it the infarct, or the core, that is that brain. And the difference between the area that it's going to die, the yellow wedge, and the red is what you call a mismatch. Oh,
just so you know.
I apologize, I think we have a bit of a disconnect here, so sorry. Now it's gonna be easier for you to follow. So you have the brain block, the blood vessel that it's blocking the brain. You have the area of that brain, you have the area of hypoperfusion, and this mismatch is what you call penumbra, which is the target of our treatment. But the idea here is that this yellow area becomes red over time. So the stroke is progressing over time, very much like a fire in a forest. And what you achieve with the procedure by reestablishing blood flow is we put the fire out. So whatever has been burned, you cannot bring back, but you stop the progression. So time is brain, and that's a very important premise. So how is a stroke treated? Well, if it's a clogged pipe, you can use a chemical to dissolve the clogged pipe, right? And that's called TPA or TNK. It's a blood clot buster medicine. It works very well. It's easy to use, broad application. It's very time sensitive, and in general, that time window is just 4.5 hours. There are some studies to push that a little longer, but there is an important concept here that you have to use, which is the number need to treat. There is no treatment that you treat one patient and that patient benefits always. So in general, you have to treat 100 patients to have 13 patients going back to normal with the blood clot buster medicine. 1 in 3 patients out of the 100 will actually have some sort of improvement, may not get to normal. But there is also a number need to harm, and that number is 6. So 6 patients are gonna be harmed by the treatment, and doesn't matter whether it's a blood clot buster medicine, a medicine or a surgery or a procedure. This is just the face of medicine. It will happen. In the case of TPA, 3 of those people, you have permanent damage, and 1 will die because of the treatment. So you need to understand anything you do, you have risks. The problem with the TPA is it works well in the smaller clots, more distal in the brain, but as you approach the more proximal clots, it doesn't work as well. Longer clots don't respond as well to the TPA, and as you can see here, these are a bunch of clots you have retrieval from the brain over time. They can be very, very long, so TPA, it's not going to work. So what do you do to a clogged pipe if you can't dissolve it with a chemical? You do a mechanical treatment, and that's what you did. That's the birth of intraarterial treatment for stroke. This is essentially what a mechanical thrombectomy is. We thread a catheter typically through the femoral artery in the groin, take it all the way to the neck. Through that catheter, you can take a tiny wire called a microguide wire, a little catheter called a microcatheter. We cross the clot. We remove this microguide wire, and then you put a device called stent retriever. Essentially, it's a wire mesh stent that is used to retrieve the clot. So you can unsheath that device. It radially displaces the clot and incorporates the clot in its struts, okay? And then you can then fish the clot out of the brain. So this is what the mechanical thrombectomy procedure is. Here is an example. This is our operation room, the angiography suite. These are our tools. You can overcome the high tortuosity of the vascular anatomy of the head and neck and the brain. We get to the neck blood vessel, take a picture, find where the clot is, put the stent retriever across the clot, take it out, and if you're lucky, the clot will come out. As you can see here, you fully reperfuse the brain, the patient will have a clinical improvement, as in this case, from having complete paralysis in the right side, not being able to speak and comprehend, the patient was essentially nearly back to normal with the exception of a minor facial droop. How powerful is this treatment? It is one of the most powerful treatments in medicine. It turns out that the number you need to treat is around 3 to 7, so around 4, which coincides with the number you need to treat of antibiotics in sepsis. Okay, that's how good it is. It's a lot more powerful than other treatments you have in neuroscience, and it's a lot more powerful actually than coronary intervention for heart attack. But now let's talk about what really matters, about the journey and what you learn along this journey. Okay. The inception of intraarterial treatment for stroke actually dates back from 1958, so a long time ago, right? It's actually 2 decades before coronary intervention. However, as we all know, coronary intervention, STEMI, heart attack, evolve a lot faster, right? And why is that? You know, my colleagues from cardiology, and I have a big passion for cardiology, I almost became a plumber of the heart as opposed to a plumber of the brain. They say, well, you don't get it. You guys are just 20 years behind us in terms of logistics and evolution, and it is true. I go back to them and say, hey, I love the heart. I think it's really cool, great science. But it's like comparing a pump versus a supercomputer. It is a lot more complex, okay? And you're gonna be talking about what you guys are trying to do next. It's gonna be hard, okay? So the first bump in the road is the higher complexity of the target organ, okay? One of the big problems you have in terms of safety is brain bleeding. You reperfuse the brain, that stroke bed can bleed in about 1 out of 20 cases, and that can be catastrophic. The heart almost never bleeds from reperfusion. Okay, it's a lot more forgiving. The cell lines that you have are very different, and that actually interfere even with our scientific progress. And I'm sure you're gonna see a different set of challenges as you go to BCI, which is actually a much more ambitious endeavor. We actually started pretty well. In 1999, first trial, randomized trial ever called PROACT-2 was positive. 180 patients, which at that time wasn't really a small trial, p-value of 0.04, demonstrating that you were 2.1 times more likely to achieve full independence at 90 days if you had the intraarterial thrombolytic to dissolve the clot through the catheter than not. However, that wasn't enough for the agents to approve this treatment for whatever reason. Small trial, they failed to show a benefit in the secondary endpoint, maybe some imbalances in baseline characteristics, high bar. And I think this was the second bump in the road, okay? Too high of a bar for treatment approval. And there are consequences to that. Risk aversion comes next. So pharma essentially left, okay, the field of acute stroke intervention. And whoever came next, and you're gonna talk about the devices, went for lower risk strategies, okay? And who came next? The devices. So we evolved from drugs to devices. The first device was this corkscrew-shaped device called the Mercy device, okay? The second one was more like an aspiration catheter called Penumbra. And these companies paved the way to where you are right now. And they paved the way not doing the high-level scientific things that I love, like randomized clinical trials. They were actually more modest. They did open-label, single-arm trials, okay? They realized this is gonna be a long journey, it's gonna be difficult. So let's go baby steps. They work closely with the FDA, and they found a path to innovate, and this case was the 510(k) clearance pathway, okay? Which essentially allows you to just show substantial equivalence to a pre-existing device that the FDA called the predicate device. This allows for the Mercy device to exist and be commercially available, and for the company to start generating revenue just so it could invest in the next generation of devices. Okay. Also, we didn't go for the whole grail, which is I'm gonna show that the patient is gonna be walking, talking normal. The primary endpoint of these studies was simple, was like, can this device safely open the blood vessel? That's it. What happens to the patient is gonna be a secondary endpoint, but again, baby steps. Let's not be over ambitious because this is gonna be a difficult task. With that in mind, there were repercussions to this approach that I want to share. Again, everything will come with a pro and a con. There are consequences. Scientifically, it was a setback, okay? Why? Because as you're trying to climb the tree of evidence-based medicine, we as neuroendovascular and stroke physicians went to single-arm trials, that's the low-hanging fruit, as opposed to do the randomized clinical trials like cardiologists, okay? And we will discuss the problem. The first problem is you don't have the ultimate proof. If you don't have the ultimate proof, you become like US politics, you become polarized, right? You have people like myself look at this. If I open the vessel, I'm 20 times more likely to have a good outcome. This is amazing. But then there are other colleagues who goes like, well, your treatment causes bleed in the brain, about 5 to 10% of the cases. Not so sure it's great. And then you have all this skepticism and this debate and uncertainty, but the field is moving forward, right? Because again, you're generating investment, interest, and things are moving forward. And over time, we actually understood that we were under-treating patients, unlikely cardiologists. Why? Because again, because you did single-arm trials, you could only compare thrombectomy patients with thrombectomy patients, no controls. When you compare two patients that had the procedure, you're gonna say the older patient, the patient with the low aspects, that the bigger stroke, and the patient that is delayed treatment time, it's gonna do worse. Yes, of course, right? If you are older, if you have a bigger stroke, if you have late treatment, you're gonna do worse. These are predictors of outcome, okay? Well, cardiology started with a different mindset. They didn't compare treated with treated. They compared similar patients that were treated versus similar patients that were not treated, the controls. Then they never bothered with predictors of outcome. They could define the whole grail for decision-making, which is the treatment effect modifier. And then they go like, no, yes, age is bad in terms of your chances of having a good outcome, but it's much better if you get treated despite your age than if you don't, because yes, the older patient, okay, with treatment does worse than the younger patient. But without treatment, the older patient does a lot worse than the younger patient without treatment. So the treatment effect size, the difference between treatment and non-treatment, if anything, it's actually larger in the older patient. And this is just an example that set back our field for a long time. Many people weren't treated because they had large strokes or because they were late treated or because they were old, because of this confusion that came because the design we picked to begin with. So every decision will have a consequence. Having said that, because we did what we did, we could fund research innovation to advance. So I think even on retrospect was still the right move. So, and this is a great example. What you have here is a bunch of imaging that predict outcomes, like the size of stroke, the collaterals, the size of the clot, but none of them actually modify the benefit of the treatment. In fact, we don't know who are the patients. When I start this, we were looking for the patients that would benefit from mechanical thrombectomy. Now you're trying to find those who don't. You are in a very different situation, okay? So this is probably the best one, okay? It's the third bump in the road, the biggest one, which are the negative trials. And I always careful when I talk about negative trials because I don't think there is such a thing. Every trial brings knowledge and paves the way for progress. And I think that's what happens here. We made mistakes. Our tools, our devices weren't great. We also didn't know how to design these trials and select the patients properly. And you had 3 papers in New England Journal of Medicine that were negative. This was like a catastrophe, okay? But that catastrophe put us together and said, we gotta work together and move on to the next phase, otherwise this field is dead. And it really gave us the impetus for the next steps. But this was only partially possible due to technological evolution that happened because we started, right, to innovate and starting to have funding and money coming into this field. So you have to get it started. And to give you an example, this is the first company called Concentric Medical, and it was sold in 2011 for $135 million. But it wasn't sold because that little corkscrew Mercy device they had. It was sold because they were doing a trial with a stent retriever called Trevo, that they could only run the trial because they made money through selling the Mercy device. So that kind of set the stage to the next step of this company. And just so you understand what happened to the second company that came into the field, which is Penumbra, just in the first quarter of this year, they made more money that the other company was sold for. That's how much growth you have seen in this field since, okay? So second generation devices, they were the stent retrievers that were much more superior than the Mercy device. We now have the better technology. We are ready to go to the next step. There is an evolution with devices from the corkscrew to small aspiration catheters to stents, stent retrievers. Now you have what you call the mega bore catheters. Just finished a couple FDA trials with them. And I don't know what's coming next, but I know you're gonna have a lot of work to do. And the other bump that you have to overcome was the planning of the trials. What is the primary endpoint? We were asking, okay, what should be the endpoint? We struggled that for a long time, but again, baby steps. We start with the revascularization goal, right? Revascularization goal, that's the simplest one, easy to grasp. If you open the vessel, you save brain. If you save brain, you should do better. There is some logic to it. Let's start there. But then we had to go, okay, we need to show effectiveness if you really wanna prove this, put the skepticals to silent, and then treat more people, right? So you have to use a clinical endpoint. But we didn't start very well. So we use this modified rank scale, which is a scale that puts you from 0 being normal to 1, maybe some deficits, but essentially normal. 2, you are fully independent, but you do have some deficits. 3, you are no longer fully independent, but you can walk on your own. And then you move to 4, wheelchair bound. 5, you are essentially bedridden, incontinent, depending on others, and 6 is deaf, okay? And in the beginning, we did something that wasn't very good. We used dichotomized approach, was all or nothing, okay? And while this may increase the power, it's a little bit unfair, right? Because you have an all or nothing approach where in reality, what you want is you want to show any improvement along this scale, right? It shouldn't be all or nothing. Why? Because some people, they are too old or they have strokes, they are too big to have the whole grail, to be almost back to normal. But they could still have an improvement, so you have to account for that. And this is when the ordinal shift came. You are giving credit for every transition across the scale, okay? So it's a more refined way to do this. Then there is an even more refined way. It turns out that this scale, it's not linear. It's not the same one point of value. It's more like ordinal, and it has different weights. Let's do the following exercise. If I give you 6 family members going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 MRS, okay? And I gave you 1 point for you to move then along the scale, I can promise you, you're not gonna take someone who's dead to be incontinent, bedridden. That's probably not much of a benefit, right? But you're probably gonna take someone who's a 5 into a 4 or a 4 into a 3, okay? Versus spend your point going from nearly normal to normal, okay? So these things have different weights. So what I'm trying to say is, things will evolve, right? Our understanding will evolve. You will get more sophisticated and more patient-centric at some point. But again, this will likely be baby steps. But the lesson for us here is, you know, it's not about having a good outcome, but rather about having a better outcome. We then, with better designs, better endpoints, better technology, we had the global victory. We had 5, 6 global randomized clinical trials, highly positive, which essentially showed that you are 2.5 times more likely to achieve any improvement across the scale if you have thrombectomy, and you are essentially 2.7 times more likely to achieve full independence at 90 days if you have the thrombectomy. That was fantastic. And then you proceed to the more difficult categories like the basal artery occlusion, the strokes in the back of the brain, as well as the late time window. Remember I said stroke, it's like a fire in the brain, right? So it spreads over time. Time is very important. In the beginning, we thought that we couldn't treat patients, you know, later than 6 or 8 hours. Turns out that we can, and they still benefit, okay? Then we noticed that there were many people that we were excluding from treatment. And we start reflecting about another phenomenon that may happen in your situation, which is the denominator fallacy. Okay, what is that? So there is this problem where you are treating only the ideal candidates because you want to see this miraculous effect, right? But then by doing so, you're leaving out people that could still benefit even if to a lesser degree. And here is kind of how this works. You know, we can use the CT perfusion selection methodology, which is very sophisticated and elegant. When you do this, we select a certain percentage of patients that will come with stroke. And you have an amazing response. 1, 2, 3, right? 1 out of every 3 patients will benefit when I select patients as such. And after I remove the clots, 70% of them will do well. And this is great, right? Well, you can use a simpler paradigm to select and include patients with just a non-contrast CT. When you do so, you end up treating a lot more patients. But your treatment response isn't as beautiful. Now I have to treat 5 patients in order to see 1 response, and my overall rate of good outcome drops to 35%, that's half. So if you are a patient, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to that hospital where you have 70% chances of a good outcome with the procedure? Or this one where the chance of good outcome with the procedure is just 35%? Who wants to go to the first hospital? Okay, who wants to go to the second hospital? Okay, there are a bunch of people who are not going to get treatment. You're going to have a big stroke, okay? That was a mistake. But in any case, here is what happens. This is fascinating. And again, I think that will be an analogy with BCI, okay? When you over-select because you are thinking only about the patients you treat, when in reality, our responsibility as physicians and healthcare professionals are over all the patients that you evaluate for potential treatment. When I look at the 100 patients that I had, right? In the first model, I benefit 10 out of 100. But when I look at that 100 patients in the second model, I end up benefiting 16 out of 100, 60% more people. As a proud operator, I want to have the bragging rights of the 70% good results, right? But that's not the way you should think as a good doctor, right? It's about the overall results that you look at the entire population that you had the opportunity to treat. So I want to throw this concept of over-selection out there. Maybe in the beginning you need to do some over-selection as a proof of concept, but don't stop there, okay? And then just to show what this over-selection thing was doing, there are now 6 large trials that were done worldwide that have demonstrated that even if you have bad imaging, really bad image, you're gonna have better shift, better utility-weighted, higher rates of functional independence, higher likelihood of walking independently, even lower mortality without having a lot more complications with intracranial hemorrhage just because you had a large stroke. So your chances of doing well are lower, but you still benefit. And this is an important concept, you need to distinct, okay? So now to close, I want just to point some key differences across what we did and what you are about to do, okay? Well, what you did, yes, is the brain, it's very cool, but honestly, we are just unclogging the pipes that cool a supercomputer. What you guys are talking about doing is super connecting 2 supercomputers. This is a much more ambitious and complex task, right, than what we did. This is not on your side. However, when you look at the study design, I'm actually quite jealous because I think you have the better opportunity here. When you have a thrombectomy, right, you are dealing with a patient who has acute stroke. Well, at that point in time, right, where I have the opportunity of intervening or not, I don't know what is the future of that patient, right? I don't know if he's gonna be in terms of the disability scale, where he's gonna be there, and I don't know what my intervention is gonna do with him in terms of benefit being neutral or harm. So you can see it's a very complex situation that requires for the ultimate response, right? The ultimate answer, a randomized clinical trial. However, if you're dealing with brain-computer interface, and I think we all can agree the low-hanging fruit, big problem, where you should start, not limit ourselves to, but start as paralysis, that patient can serve as his or her own control, okay? Because you know the patient had an event, and it could be even congenital, as it was mentioned, okay, or acquired a trauma, ALS, stroke, right? But now that patient is already there, you know the functional status of the patient. That is not a dynamic situation, it's a much more static situation. So it's much easier to use the patient as his or her own control. And I'll tell you, there is no better way to have a control than the very same individual, right? There are no confounders other than the intervention. And because of that, I'm quite jealous of what you can do. I think to prove this, it's gonna be a little simpler than what you had to do. And with that, some closing thoughts here. I think the successful implementation of novel technologies is often a stepwise process. It involves progresses and setbacks. Oftentimes, it also involves a choice that will come with a consequence, and you just have to pick the best one, right? Close collaboration among scientists, clinicians, patients, the regulatory agencies, and the funding bodies is gonna be paramount, and I think we saw that very well with the beautiful story of mechanical thrombectomy. This is, I think, something I really have to tell you because I think this is like the coolest field that I have ever been involved. But if the term quantum leap applies to any field in medicine, that is the development of brain-computer interfaces. I think we are having science fiction on the level to overcome a problem that it's extremely serious, that affects millions and millions and millions of people, just giving them some level of sometimes even basic function. So with that, I want to thank you for all your incredible efforts, whether you are an engineer, a scientist, a clinician, a patient who's advocating for your rights, regulatory body, or a funding body. Really looking forward to take any part in this incredible journey and to the day that I can offer this technology to my patients. With that, I'll conclude. Do not take this self.
Thank you, Raul, for such an inspirational presentation. And there's so much that we can learn from your journey. through thrombectomy and everything that you shared. It's really extraordinary. We have time for maybe just one question. I do want up, and yes, I'm going to run this mic.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Emily, I'm from NINDS. I think it's really notable that in the early thrombectomy trials, you had a primary endpoint that was not functional improvement, right? Not clinical improvement, but a biomarker of that in opening up the vessels to have perfusion again. And as we think about primary endpoints in BCI, as we move into the afternoon, I wanted to get a sense of what was needed to have agreement between the field and the FDA on this as a primary endpoint. As you mentioned, there's a clear logical connection between opening up a blood vessel and clinical improvement. But what was that journey like with the FDA? Was that what kind of evidence was required to justify this as a clinically meaningful biomarker? And how much coordination was there among these early companies who were bringing these devices forward to push that as an endpoint? Thanks.
So I probably should also invite my colleagues from the FDA to give their viewpoint on that. But I have been involved with many new devices that have come to the market since, and I really like the way the FDA has looked at this, okay? And I think I gave a recent lecture about this, and it was during the Olympics time. And I think it really depends on what is the medal we want to get. And I think that's the way you should approach it, okay? You want a gold medal, you gotta get the ultimate proof, the ultimate certainty of safety and clinical effectiveness for whatever device you have. And in the thrombectomy arena, we have what is called a clinical indication, like this device is approved, okay, to demonstrate improvement after the treatment. But then you have the opportunity for the bronze medal, okay, which is you can have to show safety and you have to show equivalence to all the other devices that are out there in the market for whatever they were approved, which is in general recanalization, open the blood vessel, okay? And the reason to have that bronze medal there is if you don't have an easy path for innovation to get to the market, you can't move things forward, right? So I think for those that are more ambitious and better funded, yes, they can go for the gold medal, but you have to have a bronze medal approach always, right? You get to the podium, you have your, time in the spotlight, you start generating revenue, you can improve your technology, you can organize yourself, then fight for the gold medal in the next Olympic, right? But if there is no reward, right, for those who aren't highly funded or can give you the ultimate proof, you're gonna kill innovation. And I do very much like this process now. There is a lot of push now for the FDA, and I think I may be partially at blame because we start pushing for that in the device community for randomized clinical trials, but it's a problem because they take a lot longer, they are a lot more expensive. So I really think you need to open these two, keep these two avenues in order to foster innovation and expedite progress.
Wonderful. Raul, thank you
so much.
Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. You are truly a gold medalist of thrombectomy trials and of inspiring us all. It was really just phenomenal insight about how this field can continue to develop. So with that great presentation, it is my pleasure to bring to a close the first annual inaugural public meeting of the Implantable BCI Collaborative Community. We will wind down in just a few seconds, just a few thanks, and then we'll talk about the afternoon. Would like to thank our AV team from ETS for doing a great job, both in the room and in Zoom. So thanks so much. Would like to thank, please, yes, thank you. Like to thank both Beth Travers and Jake Guzman, both from Brown, for their incredible support in helping to make this happen. So thank you both. And I do really want to make sure that everybody thanks Jessica Kellman, our program manager, for over the last few months really putting together a phenomenal program and making it possible for us to all be here today. So thank you, Jessica.